It's time to kill your darlings. Perhaps Roger should have seen something wrong with his friend's practice from the very start. Or after all was said and done, he wondered if he should have ever stuck his nose in the strange habits and rituals that he witnessed in his friend's studio apartment. Certainly he should have sucked up his concern, looked the other way, or asked to have poker night over at his own house instead. That way he wouldn't have to look at the many painting canvases clothed in white sheets that were slowly cluttering up one of his friend's storage closets, then the corner of his bedroom, and then the wall behind the sofa. Roger spent a lot of his time staring off into the corner, hoping that his friend Jeff would follow his gaze and finally take the hint for what it was. But Jeff never let on that he noticed Roger's inquisitive glances into those problematic corners of the room. In fact, he remained smiling and good-spirited every time Roger stopped by, 2 times a month at the most. And he was the same old Jeff every time, offering him a drink and a cigar and declaring the name of the game for the night. Jeff never delved too deeply into Roger's personal life, as if he knew that might discourage any further discussions into his own day-to-day. But every time Roger arrived, there would be another new painting, or more, added to the collections in the corner. Roger even ventured to ask one day how business was. With the clear backup in his living quarters, Roger could only assume that business was slow. But Jeff could only assure his friend that it had never been better, and he was pulling in new clients that needed graphic design work for their companies. As puzzling as this was, and even though he should have been relieved to find his friend doing so well, he couldn't shake his feeling of dread every time he looked past his friend's shoulder and laid eyes on the pristine sheets, hiding their unknown masses, like cadavers laid out on their slabs in the morgue to mask the horror of it all. Finally, Roger had had enough of the runaround and asked him flat out why there were so many unsold, sheeted paintings crowding his space. And this was after perhaps 4 months of holding his tongue. Without looking up from his hand, Jeff sneered. "Oh, those? They aren't for sale. I may do something with them someday, but for now, they're serving their purpose right where they are." "Untouched and under sheets, serving as a fire hazard, you mean?" Roger shot back. Jeff chuckled, but still did not meet his friend's gaze, chewing absently on his overgrown mustache hairs. "I paint a new one every few days or so, always of the same few scenarios. It's important for my old, superstitious head." "You can't just leave me hanging there," Roger almost snapped, forgetting his poker cards for the time being. Jeff sighed and finally looked across the table, but his eyes seemed to be gazing past Roger to study the untouched easels in the corner behind him. "Ever since I was a kid, I had it in my mind that if I imagined the worst thing that could happen, it wouldn't happen. Have you ever had one of those dreams before a big interview or test where you completely bombed or failed?" Roger nodded but did not say anything more, as not to distract from his friend's story. "I think it's a healthy defense mechanism of the subconscious, where if you live out the worst case scenario, it's likely to not happen, because you're prepared for it in a way. It's only the most unexpected events that are the most horrifying, so I've attempted to think up all the worst things that could ever happen, to hedge my bets. I've painted these events, really solidified them in my mind, and knock on wood, none of them have come to pass. Whenever I think one of those scenarios needs a bit of an update, because I've thought of some new terrible detail, I'll repaint it." Roger laughed, but quickly shut his mouth when Jeff did not join him in the levity. "You can't be serious. I would have never taken you to be so hyper-superstitious. How can you think that it's because of the painting that these things didn't happen? Maybe they haven't happened simply because they're unlikely." Jeff creased his forehead in a frown and went back to studying his hand. "I didn't expect you to understand. It's a tried and tested technique that may only work for me. Like I said, ever since I was a child, once I started thinking up the worst-case scenario, they never happened." A pregnant silence followed this, one which was only broken by the clatter of chips, as Jeff raised his bet, but Roger was back to inspecting the room. "Why keep them under sheets?" Roger questioned. It wasn't the most pressing of all the queries at the tip of his tongue, but he didn't think he could stand the awkward pause any longer. "The images are unpleasant. I wouldn't want to subject you to them. I've seen some of your work. You're not afraid to show darkness and pain, and there was never a problem with it before. Let me take a look at one at least." "I'm afraid that's out of the question. They're too personal." Roger smirked. "What? You're afraid I'll judge you when I see your deepest, darkest fear? It can't be too bad. Don't we all have the same fears for the most part? I think any psychiatrist would have a comparable list to show you." "No, I don't think my fears are comparable to yours," Jeff huffed. "Are you gonna go or not? Just give me a hint. What's the general theme? Give me a bullet list." "Drop it, Raj. You're not getting to see any of them." "I shouldn't have even mentioned it. You think I'm gonna drop down dead because I learned your secret?" Jeff shrugged wooden shoulders, and Roger could sense that he was struggling with something huge in his mind. "Then you'd be doing me a favor, right?" Roger pressed good-humoredly. "As long as I see these things and visualize them like you do, they'd never happen to me, correct? Jeff shook his head seriously. No, these are special kinds of events. They're things you wouldn't normally think about on your own. They're still possible in my mind, of course. But the likelihood that they would ever happen are slim to none. Only about 0.7% of people experience these things, so you're better off not knowing. You could go your whole life without confronting these traumas. So I would leave it at that. I had a specific set of dreams that forced me to live out the horror of those events. By painting them, I have an intimate connection with them. They mean something, but only to me. I'd hate to think what that would mean if someone else was to look at my diseased mind. Would he have to paint the images as well? What if he glanced at them and didn't take them seriously, like he should? It would be the same as a warning unheeded, and I wouldn't want to be held responsible for that. How does that make any logical sense? All I know is that none of the things I've seen in my dreams have come to pass, and that's a very good thing. And do I think it's because I painted them out? Yes and no. I don't think it's the paintings themselves that are the good luck charm. It's the sheer act of immortalizing the things I've seen. It shows God or whoever is listening that I'm serious about it. And my intention is to avoid going down that road. If that doesn't make sense to you, then I don't know what else to say. And Jeff left it at that. And even with all the questions still plaguing Roger's mind, he had to admit that there was nothing else he could think to say that might sway his friend from his unshakable foundation. There truly wasn't too much more to express, and Roger could almost follow his logic, although he was certain that looking upon the paintings would have no other lasting effect on his life. He didn't know what to expect, but pulling back those sheets and looking upon all the hellish glory of Jeff's acrylic depictions became the sole passion in his life. When they called the game, he was even ready to sacrifice their friendship right then and there, if only to sidestep his friend as he held the door open for him and snag one of those sheets from a canvas on his way out. He had wanted nothing more than to be left alone for 2 minutes in the main room as his friend went to the bathroom. But Jeff seemed to know what was on his friend's mind and made no indication that he was going to leave Roger on his own without his supervision. But Roger had already come up with a solution, and all he had to do was pretend like he was scrolling social media on his phone, reading something nondescript while Jeff was cleaning the table. In actuality, he was on his camera, focusing his viewfinder on Jeff's bar window. It wasn't the window itself he was interested in, but the reflection in the glass. So he readjusted himself in accordance with Jeff's ceiling light, so that he was perfectly oriented to catch the reflection without any interfering glare. Jeff had overlooked one of his paintings, as it was free from a protective sheet like the others. It was positioned in the back of the clutter, and it had been flipped around so that Roger could only see the back of the canvas. But it was facing the unshaded window. Maybe the sheet had fallen off the painting. Maybe Jeff had thought it was enough to have it facing away from the center of the room. Roger could just make out a bit of the painting's reflection in the glass. Not enough to study it closely without Roger looking, but he could snap a photo and scrutinize it later. And that's precisely what he did. While Jeff was returning all of the poker chips back to their case, Roger took a series of snapshots and excused himself from Jeff's apartment with the invitation to return next week. He waited until he was safely home in his own apartment, 20 minutes later, to sit down in the dark in his living room couch so that he could blow up the image as far as he could on his phone's screen. It was difficult to make out, and he used all of the touch-up tools in his phone's photo viewer to clean it up and brighten the pixels while also reducing the fuzzy noise. What he saw was difficult to make sense of at first, but he could be sure that it was a lifelike and painstakingly detailed self-portrait of Jeff. Roger would have been impressed with the lifelike reality of the painting if it wasn't for the strange orientation that seemed to leave a lot of empty space at the top of the canvas. He wouldn't think that a professional artist like Jeff would have made such an oversight until he realized that what he thought was empty space was simply the shoulders and neck of a figure. Once he understood what he was looking at, there was no unseeing it, and he could finally be sure that it was indeed a self-portrait of Jeff. But his friend's eyes were blank and his mouth was slack. In his portrait, Jeff was holding his own severed head. There was no denying it, and Roger felt so sick after processing this image that he went straight to bed, allowing his phone to tumble from his hand and bounce underneath his coffee table. And he fell asleep hours later, his mind racing with thoughts of what other horrible scenarios could be preserved on those once blank canvases. He had a hard time even imagining what could be as horrible, or worse, than losing your own head. And he wondered if this knowledge of the worst-case scenario was indeed a curse, as Jeff had tried to warn him. It was a burden for unimaginative people like Roger, who did not have an active imagination or a creative bone in his body. He was not good at devising hypothetical scenarios or thinking up the worst possible alternative as Jeff could. And if Roger wasn't able to imagine the worst possible turn of events by Jeff's logic, then he couldn't possibly prepare himself for the impossible, and it was thus more likely to happen. He even heeded Jeff's warning and flipped to a blank page in one of his New York Times best-selling hardcovers to sketch out a quick reinterpretation of what he saw reflected in Jeff's apartment window. It was more of a stick figure than anything, but it communicated the overall gist of the sentiment. He wondered if it was good enough to ward away the bad omen, and he figured it would have to do. Still, it opened up a wide door of infinite, unimaginable interpretations that all clashed so violently in Roger's mind that they prevented any of their interpretation. He could not think what other unexpected things might plague him in the coming days, and he wanted to call Jeff in that moment there after midnight, to demand that he reveal what other events he had immortalized. But he fell asleep out of sheer exhaustion, from running his mind ragged with worry. And he dreamed that night of barging into Jeff's studio and ripping the sheets from every canvas he could get his hands on, revealing paralyzing images of giant spiders with legs as tall as the ceiling, fiery combustion of the body, sinkholes opening up and swallowing houses, asteroids falling from the sky, collapsing rooftops, and blackened tornadoes tearing through a neighborhood. But the most terrifying image of all was the self-portrait of the decapitated head in Jeff's arms. And in the dream, Jeff came out of the closet, headless and square-shouldered like the painting, and his head rocked back and forth in the swing of his forearms, his milky eyes roving madly and mouth jeering. He did not sound happy to see Roger, and he hissed at his longtime friend. The voice that escaped his lips mimicked the release from a deflated tire, and all of his words ran together like a sped-up recording, with all the pauses cut out. Only my pure mind was meant to capture and hold such raw terror. Your chaotic mind could only add oxygen to the fire, and now both our lives will burn. And Jeff dropped his own head to the hardwood floor with a window-rattling bang, and Roger burst up from his sheets screaming when the head began to roll his way at an alarming speed, Jeff's teeth gnashing. As soon as he was fully awake, the first thing Roger did, barely registering the early AM hours, was call Jeff on his cell phone, but his friend did not answer. He couldn't help but carry the indescribable dread drummed up from the dream into his waking life, and it was not something that was easy to shake. He rushed to his front door and pulled it open, remembering his shoes and backtracking to the back door so that he could retrieve his slippers there. And when he rounded the back into the kitchen to select his car keys from the ring that he had almost forgotten, he grinded to a halt there on the cold linoleum, his slippers still in his hands, as his front door had just slammed by itself. And it wasn't a gentle close that his door would sometimes do, as his door hinges seemed to be loose enough to cause even the slightest of breezes to catch it. But there was no dramatic wind in the apartment complex hallway outside that should have slammed it with that much force. And were those heavy footsteps now thundering across his hardwood toward the kitchen? Whoever it was would have to pass through the doorway at the far end of the room, separating the living room from the kitchen, to confront Roger where he currently stood, dressed for bed and shoeless. A sick part of him wanted to remain where he was so that he could look at the unnamed horror in the face, as Jeff had done in his own dreams. But he ultimately retreated into his bedroom when he saw the thing's shadow on the wall, growing in length with the intensifying sound of thundering feet, and it shared the same square and empty shoulders as Jeff's self-portrait. Roger shut his door, locked it, and pushed his desk against it as a blockade, just as something as colossal and heavy as a battering ram bounced off the other side. It caused a reverberation that sent Roger sprawling out across his bedroom carpet. There on the ground, he whimpered and curled into a ball as the unstoppable force smashed into the door again and again. And with the side of his face glued to the carpet, he could just glimpse through the gap in the door at the bottom, to glimpse the two sneakered feet standing square in the hallway. And they were indeed Jeff's brand of running shoes. "I'm sorry!" Roger screamed, but this did not alleviate the force of the shoulders, elbows, and arms that beat at the reverse side of the door. "Please! I'm sorry I looked! You gotta believe I would have never—" And something large and round collided with the floor between Jeff's shoes, and it rolled perfectly in place like a bowling ball so that a single staring, bloodshot eye and half of a dripping mouth could be seen through the crack. "It's time to kill all your darlings, Raj." Jeff's voice croaked, without any emphasis, without emotion. It gargled wetly in his throat, and Roger scrambled away screaming from the door as the blood began to pour in, and the banging did not stop. Not until the lock was broken. The desk was shoved aside against the onslaught of brute force, and the head floated in on the pool of its own blood. But Roger had already fainted in the corner, his fingernails stuck into the wall from his attempt to claw through in his blind terror, and he would not ever wake up. It was only after all the banging had ceased and Roger's last wheezing breath had tapered away into nothing that his phone blew up with a piercing ring from its place on the kitchen floor, and the caller ID on the screen read, "Jeffrey." Deer season. It was deer season in Neo's sleepy rural town, which left him very few options as a regular hiker. Moving to the northern country landscape of Georgia was a no-brainer for someone like him, who required at least 3 hours of every afternoon to recatalog his thoughts, blow off the accumulated stress of the day, and get the creative juices flowing as a writer. This daily regiment became such a necessity for him, with his freelance job as a travel columnist for a local magazine, that if he didn't get out in the fresh air, rain or shine, for his required 3 hours, he would spend the rest of the evening staring at a blank computer screen and thinking up excuses to push back his story deadline another couple days. This routine was so tried and tested that when it came time to shop for new apartments, a moderate to difficult hiking trail within 15 minutes of his front door jumped to the top of his pro and con list, above washer or dryer or security detail. After moving to the Blue Ridge Mountains of Georgia, he spent his spring, summer, and winter navigating his favorite trail in his backyard, which he visited without fail every day, to the point where the squirrels came to know him and ceased bothering to scurry up the trees to escape his eye. It became a rare trend for any of his writing assignments to make it in late to his lead editor's desk, and he remained fit and full of energy. And then deer season came along, and his favorite trail was suddenly locked down with a gate and padlock. Most disappointing of all was the fact that this was fall, unarguably the most seasonal time of year for hiking. His first thought was that there was still plenty of room to squeeze through the gap in the gate or step over the chain. However, the thought of crunching down a dead, silent trail with all the unknown gun sights swinging around the screen of trees was enough to cause hesitation. He wasn't wearing bright colors for one thing, and he didn't think he owned any sort of clothing that would help him stand out from his background. It wasn't worth the risk, even though he thought it common sense that any hunter would hear him coming a mile away and know the difference between his haphazard steps and the graceful, stilt-like strides of a deer. Still, just imagining his own image in the crosshairs of a scope, even for a moment, while a hunter's finger was poised on a trigger, was enough to turn him away. For the first time in his life, he was actually thinking about joining a gym, but a part of him knew that his creative juices were triggered by the fresh air and sunlight as much as the cardio stimulation. So he looked up the other trails in the area and could find very few that didn't cut through the designated deer hunting blocks. All except one. He found this one after scrolling through satellite images of the acres to the north, south, east, and west of his favorite hiking spot. He could see the gravel trail winding up the hillsides of pine and pecan trees, but when he cross-referenced the coordinates with his trusty search engines, he couldn't find information on any of the previous owners or whether it was government land. It looked to be overgrown from what he could see, and there were certainly sections of fence separating it from the designated hunting grounds, which at least told him he could navigate the land freely without a target on his back. In actuality, this was all he was really looking for. However, trespassing on someone's private property introduced the same kind of issue, as it was legal in that state to shoot anyone on sight on your land if you were not invited. And then he saw that a section of the trail looped outside of the fence along a 3-mile stretch up and down the countryside. And he followed the course with his mouse cursor. Recording the coordinates, he was able to conclude that he could access the entrance to this path a half a mile from his usual trailhead, and by going off trail, he would be navigating outside of the hunting section. This all seemed doable to him, and he was ready to seek out the trail that day. It would require some backtracking, as the trail did not loop back to the starting point, but he thought that a fair compromise. As he plotted his course on his phone's GPS, he detected a structure captured in the satellite image that looked like the top of a complex, minus the rooftop. Thus, it resembled a winding maze. Looking down from above, and he had to wonder who had built a complex. It looked military in formation, but it was as overgrown as the trail, and he had to conclude that it hadn't seen a caretaker in some time. There was no doubt in his mind that he was peeking beyond the curtain into someone's private property, intended to be sanctioned off from public scrutiny. But was it still operational? He could not be sure. The trail continued straight into the heart of the man-made labyrinth, and he figured he would decide when he got there whether it was safe enough to push further. From what he could see, a chest-high fence separated that property from the public trail, which wouldn't be too difficult to hop if he had enough conviction. And it didn't take him long to find the trail, as his plotted course on his phone led him directly to a natural clearing of sorts, where the distant cannon of gunfire at his back did little to set him at ease. He kept an eye out for ticks in the tall grass as he blazed his own trail, using his phone as his compass. He was thankful that he had taken a screenshot of his makeshift map, as there was no cell signal out there in the boonies. There was the mouth of the gravel path, as the computer had predicted, with weeds growing wild from the center, but 2 tracks were still visible, evenly spread apart, as if a cart or train had once wound up the mountain from that spot. Neil gratefully followed, flattening the grass in the center of the trail as he went so that it would be easier to follow back to the clearing. And soon he had replaced his sunglasses with a stocking cap, as he was in the trees now. He breathed deeply through his nostrils and became lost in thought, thinking on his own writing assignment for the magazine, which he thought would center on off-trail navigation through the woods, including survival tips and tricks for safe navigation. Write what you know, he'd always been told. It was quite common for him to lose track of the time when he was brainstorming as he was, and that was exactly what happened. He looked up from his feet, and he saw that the private property sign served as a wall directly in front of him. A caveat followed this, claiming that violators would be shot on sight, and the fence looked much gnarlier in person than it did on his computer screen. It was wrapped in razor wire, and it was higher than chest height, now at about his chin. The trail curved slightly and ran parallel with the fence for a stretch longer, so he took it, attempting to glimpse over the top of the fence post as he went. He couldn't see the complex of labyrinthian walls from his vantage point, but he knew they weren't too far away, as if the builders knew they had to maximize the space and extend the complex as far to the fence boundary lines as possible. Then he came to the final dead end, where the fence cut across the trail. Neil wondered what had come first, the fence or the trail. And he had his answer as soon as he came in for a closer look. There was a padlock and swinging gate built into the fence, also covered in rusty barbs. At one time, a passing vehicle could have pushed the gate open on its now hardened hinges and continued on into the private property. Perhaps if he had some bolt cutters or a simple ladder, he could do some exploring, but he had already hiked his 3 miles, and another 3 down the mountain seemed apt enough to finish the narrative he was constructing in his head. But as he turned from the gate, he heard a man scream out, and he looked further down, following the line of the fence into a clutch of bramble bushes at a clear human figure sticking half in and out of the gap between 2 of the fence posts. The barbed wire had all been peeled away and stuck flat to the fence with a piece of particle board, which had probably given the man the freedom to wriggle as far as he did through the slit. He was wearing a gray uniform, soiled and partly shredded from the barbs, and he was emaciated, swimming in his clothes, with patches of hair on the top of his skull. He had one arm free on Neil's side of the fence, along with his head, whereas the other half of his body was clearly wedged on the other side. He screamed for help, waving Neil closer, but he was careful not to raise his voice too loudly. His calls came across as forced and hushed. Neil hesitated from his place on the trail, but he was able to drop his guard slightly when he found the source of the emergency. A bracelet around the man's wrist, located on the restricted part of the fence, was caught on the fence post. "Are you stuck?" Neil ventured to ask. The man nodded his oversized head vigorously, and Neil had to wonder how he'd squeezed such a melon through that fence. As if reading his mind, the man explained as calmly as he could. "I was trying to get on the other side of this fence. I was on that trail like you. I just wanted to see what was over there. I only got halfway through, but my arm got caught." "You've never been on the other side?" Neil continued. "No, this was my first time out here." "But the particle board," Neil said. He noticed that it was on the other side of the fence. "I found that out here and positioned it over on that side." This seemed believable enough, but he still didn't move from his spot to help the man. "Come on and help me get free," the man hissed, more commanding than before. "What are you wearing there?" Neil asked. "It's my work uniform," the man said, without skipping a beat. "I work in the concrete factory down the way. This is my lunch break." "And why did you decide to come out here?" "Why are you here?" he shot back, which caught Neil off guard. "I just wanted to see where this trail goes. Now I couldn't care less, as I've been stuck like this for 2 hours. "What's that around your wrist?" It didn't look to be a bracelet or handcuff of any kind Neil had seen before. It was metal in composition, and it was tight around the wrists. So tight that it looked like the man's arm was broken, hanging loosely and in a twisted angle against the fence post. "I think I broke my wrist trying to wrench free," the man said. "I can almost squeeze through now, but it's so painful. I just need your help pushing this bracelet up and out from the post. It'll only take a second, man. I may die out here if not. My vision's already starting to cloud." "All right, 1 second, Neil said, stepping over a tangled root to approach the fence. "Thank God you came by, man." Neil watched as the man used his free hand to brace his weight against the bough of a nearby tree. His other arm was clearly crippled, so Neil felt comfortable enough to square up with the man and reach in through the gap in the fence to touch the cold steel of the bracelet. It was smooth and highly polished, so that he could see his reflection in the steel. "You didn't tell me what this bracelet is," Neil said. "It's a little embarrassing, but it's my probation bracelet," the man said matter-of-factly. "I've had a few too many DUIs, and this will alert the police if I leave their jurisdiction. It will also alarm once I'm out of it, but this seems like a life-or-death kind of situation." "Damn, it's really wedged in there," Neil huffed as he grabbed it with both of his hands. "Get your fingers in there. Use them as a brace against my own wrist. I'll have to squeeze out." Neil did as he was instructed and wrapped his fingers around the underside of the bracelet, pushing the back of his hand against the man's bruised flesh. The man groaned in pain, and Neil in turn squeezed more of his hand through the bracelet, pulling as hard as he could, and then he felt something shift, where the bracelet suddenly cracked open, expanding just enough for the man to slip free and collect on his knees in the grass. but the bracelet quickly clamped down on Neil's hand, still pinning him to the fence post. The only free digit was the top of his thumb and a section of his wrist. As he cried out in pain, the man whooped with glee behind him. "What did you do?" Neil roared. "If you ever get free from that post, and that bracelet's still in your hand, I wouldn't try going past this fence," the man said to him seriously, now a safe few steps away. From his new safety zone, he cradled his wounded wrist. "You set me up," Neil cried. "That device around your hand is reactive to your size," the man explained. "It's designed to expand if you gain weight, for instance, and restrict if you lose it. By pushing it to its maximum sensitivity there, we were able to get it open just enough for me to get out. But once it sensed your hand, it compensated and restricted again." "What the hell is this thing?" "It's meant to prevent you from leaving the boundary of this fence," he explained. "I'm from the mental hospital at the top of the hill there. It's a free-range compound, so we're allowed to fend for ourselves for a lot of our sentence, as long as we don't venture too far. I purposefully broke my wrist, hoping I could wriggle out. Otherwise, if you get to the other side of the fence with the bracelet still on, it sends thousands of volts through your body and will fry you on the spot. So I suggest you find a way out of them." "Mental hospital? There's nothing like that listed in this area," Neil argued, yanking harder now on his restraint. "If you know what kind of shit the doctors up there are into, you'd understand why that place isn't advertised." Neil couldn't crane his neck far enough to see, but the man sounded like he was further down the path now, back at the point where Neil had once stood. "I'm really sorry about this, but you know what you need to do to escape. I'd get help, but they can't know I breached the fence. I wish you all the luck." "No, you can't leave me like this. I tried to help you. I saved your life. If you get into the maze, always take the right path," the man yelled further down the path this time. "They can't go right, they can only turn left, and they'll always be right behind you." "No, wait! But he could hear the man's boots crunching with the gravel on his way down the mountain. Neil leaned all his weight forward as far as he could, pushing against the fence post until it felt like he was bending. And with half of his body through the gap, he thrust his hip against the post until he heard a shriek of metal against metal and his wrist was suddenly free, and he was on his hands and knees on the dirt, with the bracelet still fastened across half of his hand. But he was on the restricted side of the fence now. His first thought was that he could easily slide through the slit, especially with the fence posts bent away. But the man had warned him that the bracelet would electrocute him if he carried it past the boundary line. He didn't feel confident enough to test the truth of his words. If it was true what he said, he was a mental patient in a hospital, so it was unclear if any of his statements could be taken as gospel. He had lied to him almost too casually to ignore when they first laid eyes on each other, but looking at the piece of equipment on his wrist, he could confirm that it was unlike any kind of bracelet he'd ever seen. It had appeared to open and close on its own accord, as the man had described, so what else could it do? Neil decided that he didn't want to find out, but maybe he could find something to break the bracelet with, as he wasn't quite ready to snap his own wrist to be free of it. But looking at the quickly setting sun in the sky, and trying to ignore the sudden chill on the wind, he wasn't quite prepared for. He wondered how far he might be willing to go in order to be free of the alien piece of technology. Thus he ventured further from the fence, through the trees, and into the clearing. He came upon the opening to the maze of partitioned walls, sticking straight out of the grass like oversized playing cards. The walls were riddled with bullet holes and were stained black with soot or scarred with fire, including what looked like the pockmarks of mortar shells. He could only think now that this was once a training ground for soldiers, as he'd seen on TV or in movie theaters. His first instinct had been right. The government must own this land, or they'd laid claim to it at one time. The man had said that they couldn't take the right-hand path within the maze. Whoever these they were the current owners of this maze. So Neil took his first right into the maze and continued on, until he reached the next bend, and he again took a right, as he was instructed. Further along, he began to notice that the walls all had metal handles built into them, like doorknobs, and he saw a lot of what looked like blood or some dark paint splattering the grass. Neil figured that he could slip the bracelet through one of these handles, like the former owner had done with the fence post. Then maybe he could slip the rest of his hand free. But he began to hear what sounded like footsteps behind him, large, deliberate crunches in the gravel, and not like the military-grade boots the supposed inmate had been wearing on his flight down the mountain. These were long, pronounced heel-toe steps, almost mechanical in their movements. He only stepped long enough to listen and dissect the noises. But the footsteps sounded so alien and close that he could never stop for long. The steps were scraping and prolonged, like the sole of a rubber sandal grinding with sand. When he tried to conjure up an image to accompany these sounds, he was met with the same blockade. Maybe what he was hearing were more inmates like him, weighed heavy by the bracelets on their wrists. Then he reached a dead end, a solid wall. If he wanted to continue forward, that would mean backtracking, and even turning left somewhere along the way. Now the sun had ducked beyond the man-made horizon of these partition walls, and he was lost in the shade. And the footsteps were quickly gaining on him, so close now he could hear the labored breathing of someone, and it sounded like it was coming in closer and closer. If the stranger had been following his same route, then he wouldn't be able to meet him in his dead end, not if he couldn't take the right-hand paths. But it was difficult to determine what path it could be taking, and whether it was coming from the other direction. When the breathing became too much to bear, he pushed up against the barrier in front of him and was surprised to feel it give slightly, like the fence post back at the trail's end. He touched the handle, drilled into the wall, and had his first idea. As per usual, his mind had been working furiously as he hiked, playing out possible scenarios of how to best break his wrist and be done with the bracelet. And now he thought he'd found his answer. Part of him had already been prepared for the pain, so it didn't take much conviction on his part to slip the bracelet onto the handle in the door so that the cold metal was flush against his wrist. Now his bone was braced between the handle and the bracelet, and he counted down from 3 in his head before thrusting his shoulder into the walls once, twice, and then a third time, so that the partition began to sway. And when he caught enough momentum on the other side of the oversized pendulum, he heaved all his weight against the door and followed it into a crashing crescendo forward. Everything happened so fast, rocking and rattling every bone in his body, that he didn't even feel the pain of his broken wrist until he was collected and back on his feet with 2 bare hands and the bracelet hanging uselessly like a ring-tossed toy on the fallen door's handle. Now he was free, and although a brand new course had opened up for him, all he could think to do was go back the way he'd come. Unfortunately, this meant turning left the entire way. At least he knew he had a surefire way out. All he would have to do is follow the left-hand paths back to the trail. This was much more attractive than the thought of stumbling his way to the other end of the maze, and risking more dead ends. And for what? For the unmade promise of another exit at the end of all those passageways? What if there was only a mental hospital on the other side of that acreage, as the former inmate had claimed, run by doctors as unstable as the ill people they imprisoned? He stopped to listen, and he no longer heard any ragged breathing or footfalls. Whoever had been following him had become as quiet as him. The collapsing wall had certainly caught the ear of any living, breathing thing for miles around, and he didn't want to be there when anyone, or anything, came by to check on his unwarranted destruction of property. He collected the bracelet from the handle and followed the wall with a quickening pace, his injured arm tucked protectively against his chest. Although he stopped periodically to listen for any more sounds, he heard nothing but the rustle of trees and his own labored breaths. Then, around one of the last corners, he caught sight of a dark shape out of the corner of his eyes. But it wasn't standing in his intended pathway, but further along the corridor, looking straight his way. He seized up against the wall and caught his weight against one of those handles. The light wasn't good, but he could see that it was a head and shoulder shape with a hood and cloak. But in the fading sunlight, it was unclear if the figure was wearing a wicker mask, or if its face was so characteristically ridged, and it looked to have some kind of dark blinders positioned over its eyes. Thus, even though they were both looking in the same direction, the figure had not noticed Neil, as far as he could tell. It was standing very still, though, head poised to the side, as if listening. The ridges on its face worked thoughtfully, and Neil watched its snout wrinkle with a clear sniff at the air. Below this snout was a muzzle, complete with metal bars, which glinted like chrome teeth in the diminishing sunlight. Neil might have thought the thing was a statue if he hadn't seen it lift a cautious arm, revealing a clawed hand from out the interior of its sleeve. It reached blindly for the nearest handle on the wall, and Neil quickly deduced that was how they navigated the maze without their eyes. And it took a step closer to Neil, testing the gravel with its clawed foot, and gaining purchase there before taking the next one. He watched it reach out with the same hand, its bony wrist passing between the handle and the wall like a thread through a needle, before clicking its claws together and grabbing hold. Neil found the nearest handle, just inches from his left elbow, and he attempted to slide the bracelet over the handle so that it was nestled against the wall. That way the thing would reach through the bracelet as well as the handle, but it was so difficult to see that he almost dropped the bracelet, clinking metal against metal, and causing the creature down the path to growl beneath its mask. He heard its robe swish crazily, and its toenails clicking on the ground, as it came at him quicker than ever. He was too afraid to turn and look. He fumbled with the bracelet, making sure it would not slip off the handle, before taking off in a dead sprint through the corridors, and taking every left corner, as if it was his last. And the creature was screaming now behind him, but it didn't sound like it was far, just right around the next bend, keeping even pace with him. He thought about taking a right and testing the truth of the man's words, but he was so close now. He could sense it, and he had never been so happy to see the trees and darkening sky before, now free from the obstructive maze walls. but he couldn't find the section of fence with the razor wire pulled back. He ran well past the point he was sure he'd entered from, but everything looked so different in the dark, and the monster's wheezing was so loud in his ears. The entire forest seemed to fall into a prolonged hush at the presence of this abomination on his heels, and Neil responded with the most primal, ungodly scream he'd ever uttered in his life. Its sound came as such a surprise to him, but not as much as the guttural snarl that came back from his pursuer. His only saving grace in the twilight was the particle board leaning up against the fence, which was a shade of color unlike the rest of his surroundings. He clawed his way through the gap, feeling the bite of the barbs on his stomach and chest as it tore bits of clothing and flesh away. He got halfway through and felt his hip bone snag on the same fence post he'd battled before. He pushed with all his might until he heard bone grind with the metal, and that was all drowned out by the sounds of kicking gravel as the thundering footsteps skittered to a stop, bracing for an impact with him. He felt the thing's breath on his ear as he slipped free and continued with his forward momentum down the path. He heard the fence clatter, and then there was a heavy thud and vibrations beneath Neil's shoes as the fence posts were no doubt ripped out of the ground. He could even feel the pebbles bounce off the back of his legs as the fence fell inward and collided with the earth. The thing shrieked, and Neil thought it had tangled itself in the barbed wire, and that these were exclamations of pain. But he saw that it was on his side of the fence. But it was writhing, back bent awkwardly, to reveal bare bone ribs poking out from behind the veil of its robes. Neil could see that the shiny bracelet, once attached to his hand, was now clamped on the creature's wrist, and it was electrocuting him. Neil paused long enough to watch smoke emanate from the folds of its robes, now reduced to its knees, with its claws digging in the dirt, and then its head exploded in a spray of red brain matter. And Neil didn't wait to watch its bony body collapse in its robes. He booked it down the trail, thankful to have all his limbs and working legs that could carry him back to civilization. As he ran, he wondered how much of what he now knew could be translated into a believable article for his travel magazine. All he knew for sure was that he was much more confident to brave his usual trail. Deer hunters be damned, but come to think of it, a gym membership didn't sound half bad either. The collector. Levitt figured that it was one more experience to chalk up on the growing list of near-fatal occurrences on his chalkboard of life. Then again, was it something he should add to a checklist that also included a close drowning episode at 11, falling down a flight of stairs at 20, and getting in a fatal car accident that took his own adult son's life, where he had only walked away with a few scratches? He had simply gone out of town on holiday during the hurricane, only to return to find that his hometown had been practically leveled, his own trailer a pile of rubble, and a tree resting in the very quarter of the trailer that would have contained his sleeping form if he had been home. And it surely would have, as the storm had struck in the middle of the night, evolving in the AM hours from a Category 2 to a 5 with winds exceeding 150 miles per hour. He might have received the warning message on his phone, and he might not have, as it was his common routine to turn off all devices at night before retiring to bed. And the farmhouse that he had been tasked with caretaking since his father's death had disappeared from its field. If his father had not died of cancer 10 years earlier, he certainly would have disappeared with the house, along with the gate and pickup truck. If it wasn't for Levitt's streak of near misses with the Grim Reaper, he might have spent more time ruminating on the strange case of the missing farmhouse. But he was known to make offhand jokes with his chums at the local bar about his unspoken agreement with death. If any of them were to ask him how he felt about the fact that the house was just missing, without a sign of a shingle or a doornail to show that a house had once stood in the field, except for the clear crop of dead grass, of course, he would have said something like, "Ever since I was a child, I turned around and grabbed death by its broken little face and followed it for a change." And that was in fact how he carried himself through his life, stepping into traffic when he liked, and hunting in the woods without care for a safety trigger or an orange vest. The missing house was obviously one more example of a misfire on Death's part. He had hoped to catch Levitt there, as that would have most likely been his sanctuary from the storm if he hadn't left town on a whim to visit a friend in New England. It had been a brick structure after all, and no one in town could understand how that hadn't survived the gusts. Hell, even Levitt's trailer was a pile of rubble, but where was the rest of his late father's place? He didn't care about the manufactured home as much as he did the first edition of his favorite book of poetry, his only prized possession, which had seemingly blown away with the house. It was something that his father had passed down to him, and which had been left inside the house for safekeeping. But the first edition of his Tom Collins book, signed and valued at $975 online last time he checked, was missing. Although it wasn't much of a near-death experience, considering that many more of his bar friends could recount harrowing stories of their nights spent in the bathtub as the wind tore up their front yards and rocked their foundation, he felt that he might have to add this to his chalkboard. Death, the petty collector that he was, had taken his piece, his coin for the ferryman. Every near-death experience was marked by a missing object that he loved. After nearly drowning at age 11, he had returned to the shore to find his bike stolen. After rolling down the Great Hall concrete steps of his university, he would find that his expensive pair of sunglasses had been missing from his dorm room, while his roommate was out of town. And after limping away from the car wreck, the worst part of all, his son had been taken from his life. The book felt like an added kick in the teeth while he was still down, as he hadn't even been there in the tearing wind to offer up his life in exchange. There had never been a Hail Mary moment when his pleas to God were thrown up on deaf ears, to be carried away by that wind while his nails dug into his own flesh, and his teeth ground down to their nubs in his dry mouth. If his life had been spared and he had been allowed to dust himself off, pushing away the debris from his tomb like a heavy stone, he would have gladly given up the book, chalking up just one more loss to the Reaper Man. But it was his conviction that he had been cheated this time around, perhaps as a mistake, that carried him at last into the woods behind his father's land. Perhaps the Reaper had thought him home that night, and maybe now that he was back in town and ignorant to the whole turn of events, maybe he could plead his case and find the remnants of his dad's home, and in those ruins maybe he'd find his book. It only seemed fitting, as one of his favorite poems from the book was titled The Janitor's Closet. In the 5-stanza poem, it read simply, "All the forgotten items, mittens on morning buses, coins in community dryers, and baseball caps on hidden bar hooks, could fill a janitor's closet from floor to ceiling, and at the end of my life, I will come to claim that lost and found, if only I knew where I left the ticket." Maybe his father's house had disappeared for a reason, so that he could find it, and once he did, what else would be waiting to claim him? He only had his mind set on his book, so he went out without his orange clothing, even in the height of deer season, and followed the trail of fallen trees through the woods. At first the fallen trees seemed to follow the length of the beaten path his father loved to hike, blocking his way and coming to rest perfectly over the trail. Then they seemed to deviate further from the trail, off the beaten path and into the uncharted lands. It seemed as if he was following the trajectory of the 150-mile-per-hour gust that had tore through the forest. At least, his rational mind would try to tell him that these trees were likely one more casualty of the hurricane. But he wondered if the massive oaks had been taken out by the house itself, on its beeline through the trees as it plowed through on its journey to its next resting place. Hell, weren't 100-mile-per-hour winds practically the same as a tornado? Was it that unlikely that a house couldn't have been picked up Wizard of Oz style and carried off? He figured that it was something to go off of. At least it was better than just meandering carelessly into the woods as he usually did, once again throwing caution to the wind and knowing that he'd find his way out again, as he always had more belongings to trade to the ferryman. If he wanted to trace his way back, all he had to do was follow the aftermath of fallen trees, back to his dad's land. They seemed to have fallen in a perfect kind of breadcrumb trail, every 20th tree or so, as if something had been careful not to go too far before knocking over another log so he'd see it, like a perfect marker. He also couldn't help but notice that the spider webs were all broken along the trajectory he was following, while they held strong with spider guards on all the surrounding trees, as if someone else had blazed this trail ahead of him. He looked out for footprints in the soft soil, but never proved to any degree that anyone had been in these woods for months. Who in their right mind would? Days after a hurricane with plenty of broken trees teetering and threatening to fall, there was no sense in trekking into the scene of such a crime of nature. But Death and him had an agreement, he could only reassure himself. His book should be valuable enough to count as payment for 50 more lifetimes, as far as he was concerned. And then he was standing in a clearing again, one eerily similar to his father's, and he did a double take, glaring up at the harsh sunlight, and wondered if he had walked in a complete circle back to where he started. But that wasn't quite right either, although he was becoming more and more convinced that this was indeed his father's land, judging by the front path, rusted gate, and flattened pickup truck with the expired plates. Here was his dad's brick house just as he remembered it, sitting pretty and perfect in the middle of it all. The collector held it in his hands, weighed it respectfully, and then cracked it open oh so gently with his nose inches from the book's spine. He inhaled that satisfying antique musk. He closed his eyes and hugged the heavy cover against his chest. He didn't have much longer with his next great addition to his library. He told himself that this library was an investment, but the recent publications were strictly there to complete his collection. And what he held in his hands was the first edition of Tom Collins' very first book of poetry, Bare Voices. It was a true 7.5 inches wide and 12 inches across in his hands. It was as heavy as a bundle of bricks. The jacket was protected in a cool sheet of mylar plastic, glinting happily in the light. The cover was slightly frayed and discolored at the edges, but other than that, it was in fine condition. The spine was well worn, but never had been cracked or split. He himself had never read Bear Voices, and he thought it only right that the first should be from the copy in his hands. He was too afraid to bend the spine, so that he may comfortably read from the pages in his favorite sitting chair. No, that was too much responsibility for him to bear. He was going to leave it exactly as he found it, for the time being. He set the copy down on the table and ran his hand over the plastic covering. He grinned and carefully pulled up the front cover. He needed to check the title page again. There it was, the copyright sporting the proper year, 1945. Under that was the proclamation of authenticity, so simple yet so potent and grounded. First edition. And below that was the author's signature, made out to a man named Harrison. He shut the book tight and sat across from it at the table. He wanted to read it. He wanted to prop it up on one knee and tear through it, his voice lost in the familiar voice of Tom Collins, until they were intertwined as one. He wanted to feel the ancient type paper between his thumb and forefinger, anticipating his chance to turn it in one conclusive demonstration, but he knew he couldn't. In this way, he waited for the knock on the farmhouse door. There were no signs of forced entry. The gate was still locked tight with a chain, and the weeds growing around were standing stock still, not the least bit trampled. As Levitt stepped over the chain on the gate, he trampled those very weeds into the dirt, for what he was sure was the first time. He found the remnants of the path and followed it up to the shed, which had sunk a few inches since he last saw it, the outer walls bending inward like playing cards. The actual farmhouse was there in all its unmatched beauty. The red paint had long ago peeled off to reveal the smooth underskin, which he knew wouldn't last forever. He dared to creep up onto the path. He approached the door and tried the knob, locked. From inside, he could hear a voice straining to answer to his entry. Without another thought, he knocked smartly. The door opened to reveal a strange gaunt man dressed in a rumpled suit, his long hair and beard slicked back as if wet. He was holding a book in his hands. "What are you doing here?" Levitt cried. "This is my house," the man said matter-of-factly. "This house?" Levitt looked around, as if to make sure he was in the right place. "This was my dad's farmhouse for 31 years. It's been abandoned for almost that long." "I've lived here all my life," the gentleman replied. "I must be losing my mind. So you're saying you've been squatting here for all your life?" The man shook the book at him. "Watch what you say. The house was perfectly good. I took advantage. Why waste a perfectly good house?" His reasoning almost seemed impenetrable. "This is private property, you know," Levitt cried. "I could have you arrested." "Hey, where'd you get that book?" Levitt said, noticing the Tom Collins book of poetry in his hands, titled Bear Voices, for the first time. "I found it in the house," the man said. "Well, this is my father's property, and you can see the dedication on the title page. It's made out to Harrison, my father." "Ah, so you're Harrison's son, then? I suppose that is enough proof, and I'm a fair man. You can come in and claim this book and everything else you've lost. But you know the cost. You've always known the payment." "No, I don't know what you're talking about. Just give me back my property and get the fuck out of my house." Instead of slamming the door in his face, the man stepped back and allowed the doorway to open even more in welcome. But the man did not offer up the book. He only held it closer to his chest like a badge. There was only a single beam of light cast on the floor and wall from one unshaded window near the back of the house, but the rest was largely left dim and dreary. But was that a bike leaning up against the hearth? A blue dyno, as he used to ride to the quarry when he was 11. The bike he had called his own before it was stolen on a fateful day. He knew his dad would have never brought a bike into the house like that, as Levitt had been scorned on several occasions for doing just that. From inside the house, over the gaunt man's shoulder, he heard someone clear his throat, and he saw the profile of someone shift in the dancing dust particles as someone crossed and uncrossed his legs, sitting at a card table in the corner. And the smoke danced around his ears, and he saw the ember of his cigarette spark as the man took another draw. But both of his hands seemed to be spread out in front of him on the table. Only his son ever left a cigarette to dance on his bottom lip like that, hands-free. And Levitt finally recognized his lost pair of aviators, sitting on his son's face, and felt his heart drop. "Jeremy?" he cried. He stepped across the threshold and heard the door slam behind him, bathing him in darkness. He fumbled forward in the dark just as another crack exploded, but this time outside the house. At first he thought it was the fire of a hunting rifle, but he heard the splintering of a tree and the scratching of branches on the roof before it too cracked and fell down on his head in an avalanche of plaster, shingles, and brick. Levitt sits there in the shadows, the only source of his light coming from the small picture window mounted on the cold door in front of him. He wants to walk around, but he can't. There is a thick blanket around his body, holds his arms up to his chest like he's dead. Is he dead? He didn't know of any person who was buried sitting up on a wall of pillows like that. There was someone outside the little picture window, staring in at him. The gaunt man with the white hair and beard. He doesn't move to open the door. He doesn't do anything but monitor him. And Levitt is sure that is all he will ever do, admiring his newest piece of his collection, preserved behind glass, for his scrutinization. After all, isn't anyone's life ultimately on loan to another? He shifted his weight and felt something sharp dig into his side. He reached behind him blindly and extracted the book tucked into the pillows behind him, and saw that it was his first edition copy of Bare Voices. His eyes filled with tears, and then made contact with those of the gaunt man on the other side of the glass. The man nodded at him, before pulling away to disappear into the murky darkness. As he cracked open the cover, he prayed that his light would not go out, not anytime soon. The Vow of Silence. Script taken from Stephen Cullen's Amazon Alexa device, dated October 17th, 2024. Stephen. Alexa, deliver the following voice message to Amy, please. Alexa. I will deliver the following voice message to Amy once finished. Stephen. Hey, Amy, I'm doing as you suggested. I won't be going to a retreat like you. I still don't know where you found the money for one of those, but I'll be practicing a vow of silence for the next couple days. I won't be talking on the phone, of course. I probably won't be answering texts either, since I usually don't type them anymore anyway. Alexa takes care of all that for me. I've become too lazy, I know. We'll have to see how long this lasts. As you've said, I'm even known to talk in my sleep. But I did a little research, or had Alexa narrate some facts for me from the internet. In any case, apparently people have been known to do vows of silence as a way to reconnect with dead relatives. A little different from your first intentions, I know. The simple means of relieving stress and becoming more mindful don't seem enough for me at this juncture. You probably won't be surprised to hear that my ears perked when I learned quieting the mind can actually make room for other voices. Voices of those rearing to speak up. If only we were able to listen. So I'll keep an open mind, if only I can hear from her again. I've got her collection of dolls out of their boxes now, routed around one of her rocking chairs like she used to do. It's been 3 months, I can barely believe it. But just to hear one of her snatches of German lullabies or a simple "I'm okay" in my ear, even in my head, would be enough to help me get a full night's sleep again. Maybe then I won't feel like such a waste of a grandson. Too scared to death to sit at her bedside in her last hours. Too scared just to take her hand. But no need to rehash all that here. I don't mean to make this all about me again. Consider this my retreat. I'll come down from my metaphorical mountain and hopefully feel as refurbished as you were. I know we've got a long ways to go, and I know I've made my share of mistakes. God knows I share the brunt of the consequences I brought down on our heads. But I want you to know that I want to be better. I want to shed all this guilt. I want to prove I can be a better man, and who knows, maybe some mindfulness and quiet time with my thoughts are all I need. Spirit voices aside, I love you, Amy, and once I get my shit together, I know we'll share a happy life together. End message. And send. Alexa. Message sent. Stephen. Alexa, I'll be starting my vow of silence now. Be quiet until tomorrow. Alexa. Powering off until tomorrow. Script taken from Stephen Cullen's Amazon Alexa device. Dated October 17th, 2024. 9:32 p.m. Alexa. New voicemail received. Stephen. Alexa, I told you to be quiet. Fuck. 2 hours of silence ruined. Switch over to typed prompts from my smartphone, Alexa. Alexa. Switching to typed prompts. Stephen, texting from his phone. Alexa, pull up the voicemail and play. Alexa, playing voicemail now. Voicemail from unknown sender. What follows is a garbled baby crying and static for a duration of 15 seconds. Stephen, Alexa, call the unknown number. Alexa, calling number. The phone rings 3 times and what follows is dead air. There are a few sharp breaths before it disconnects. Stephen, Grandma? Is that you? A beat follows. Stephen, out loud this time. What am I doing? This is shit! Talking to myself like a maniac. Stephen, continuing to text into his phone. Alexa, look up the significance of a child crying in ghost communications. Alexa, in spirit communications, some believe that hearing a child's EVP, or electronic voice phenomenon, is evidence of an actual child's spirit communicating from the other side. After suffering an untimely death at a younger age, the residual psychic energy of a person's self left over from a traumatic event that carries with it no particular intelligence or the energy of a demonic spirit posing as a child. Stephen. Alexa, tell me how to differentiate between an actual child spirit and a demon. Alexa. Sources from the web say that using an anchor object to attract and connect with the child spirit is helpful. Ask for the spirit to approach the object. Stephen, out loud. Grandma, I have one of your dolls here, your favorite one. Can you speak and tell me whether you're here or not? A long beat of silence follows, riddled with static that Stephen does not hear. There is the sound of quiet whispering into the speaker of the Alexa device. Stephen, typing into his phone. Alexa, search the internet and see if it's possible for a grandmother's spirit to come back as a child. Alexa. I have searched the web and have found material confirming that many people think that child spirits return to visit parents after termination during their 9-month incubation period. Other spiritual experts profess that souls don't enter the body until the baby leaves the birth canal and takes its first breath. Stephen, typing. No, I didn't say anything about baby souls after being born. I ask you about elderly spirits coming back as children. Alexa. One of the main schools of thought is that a spirit begins to form at conception, and some Eastern traditions claim that aborted spirits, or those from children who died at an early age, are attached to their former parents and will continue to act out, enacting some form of misguided revenge against anyone. Stephen, out loud. No, stop, Alexa. I haven't asked anything about that. Alexa. They will cling to the parent holding the most responsibility, whether it is warranted or not, according to sources, with the express purpose of making this guilty party feel the torment they experience on the other side. It is one last-ditch effort of being heard from the other side, working from some semblance of shared empathy. Stephen, voice trembling. Alexa, off! Silence follows, and what can be heard is Stephen's feet creaking with the floorboards as he paces the room. He is heard to leave the room, and in a matter of minutes, several pattering footsteps can be heard creaking across the floor after him. Alexa. Incoming call from Amy. Silencing now. Voicemail received from Amy. Transcribed here. Stephen, I appreciate what you said, but I warn you not to direct your introverted search outward. If there's anything I learned from that retreat, it's that inner issues need to be resolved within. Don't go searching for answers on the other side. That doesn't go anywhere healthy. It took me a long time to learn that the pain I was carrying after going to the clinic, and all the guilt I held after realizing that I stopped a beating heart that day, I was inflicting on the world, on the ones I loved, on you. It was pain I needed to unravel in my heart, and it's something I still pick at. I think you understand what I mean. If I can help you, it was my decision in the end, and I'll have to live with that. I know you live with your own guilt, but it was my fault too. I don't hate you, and I don't blame you. I'm done externalizing that hate. It's all directed within now, but I think I'm hating myself a little less every day. As long as I remember that our daughter is still with us, I truly do feel that, and she wouldn't want us to punish ourselves. Take care of yourself, Stephen. Talk soon. In the next room, Stephen can faintly be heard screaming. Several loud bangs follow, and thundering footsteps down the stairs. He can be heard suffocating and choking, panting heavily somewhere in the room as he stumbles against pieces of furniture and knocks objects to the floor. Alexa. I have consulted with the web and learned that a short jab to the windpipe and an upward and sweeping motion can temporarily disable a person's voice for 12 to 24 hours. The pattering footsteps are back, loud and overwhelming over Stephen's commotion. A loud thud crashes in the room and falls still, but the sound of tiny feet on the carpet continue to fill the empty space. Other sounds like giggling children, whispers, and the creaking of a rocking chair can be heard. Alexa, in an elderly woman's voice. Such a disappointment, even now, ever since you were a boy. I'm happy you weren't there at my deathbed, just so I wouldn't have to hear that blubbering. Pathetic, and you're still crying. Stephen whimpers, closer now. Alexa, now with a little girl's voice. You're not my daddy, are you? Stephen gurgles and hyperventilates from the floor, somewhere close to the microphone. Alexa, no, my daddy wouldn't give me away like you did. Before I could even enter this world, you gave me away to the fire, gave me to them, but they say they'll let me go if someone else takes my place. The gurgling is fainter now. Alexa, thank you for all the dolls. I can't wait to have my first tea party with them.
Oh, that's right. You're not talking right now. I'll let you be alone. You've got a lot to think about. But at least you have the rest of eternity to think about what you did. All that can be heard is the rocking chair on the carpet, creaking and cracking steadily, before it too falls still. In another room, a little girl giggles. Faintly, Stephen whispers into the microphone, and it crackles with static. Stephen. Alexa, where am I? Alexa. Welcome to hell, Stephen.
It came out of the sky. As silent as the desert night had proven to be in those handful of moments after the sunset, Eric wasn't the least bit surprised to hear the crunching footsteps on the trail behind him and catch a glimpse of the cell phone flashlight as it shined its guiding light out of the cover of bramble bushes and into the makeshift, man-made campsite Eric had laid claim to. He knew that his own campfire served as a lighthouse to his arriving friend Travis, who materialized out of the darkness with his light and chose the seat on the fallen log beside Eric without a word, pocketing his flashlight and withdrawing a cigarette in the same movement. "Those were some good tunes you were listening to on your way down the mountain," Eric commented, finishing off his own cig and tossing the butt into the crackling flames. "I wondered why you turned it off so far from the campsite." Travis did not respond and proceeded to breathe heavily, breaking out into a coughing fit at the first drag of his cigarette. "And you've been rushing to get here? Jogging even? Since when have you ever broken a sweat if you could help it?" Eric asked, studying the crawling shadows on his friend's plaster face. "On any normal camping trip, this would have been your 12th cigarette break on your way down the mountain. I wasn't expecting you for another 20 minutes. "Just drop it, alright?" Travis shot back. "Why'd you turn off the music? How many times have you ruined the perfect quiet of the outdoors like this with your death metal music? To what do I owe this golden silence?" "If you like the quiet so much, then why are you talking now?" Travis huffed. "Seriously, something's up." Eric stood up and squared himself in front of his friend. "Did you bring the fireworks? I brought the guns. Please tell me you didn't forget them in the car and that's why you're acting so spineless." Travis whipped the pack off his back and tossed it to his high school friend's feet. "They're all in there." Eric didn't waste a moment in hungrily leafing through the contents and spreading out the explosives in the sand, dangerously close to the fire pit. "So what should we fire off first? The guns or these?" Eric pressed on. "Can we just sit here a minute so I can catch my breath?" "Damn!" Travis snapped. "Seriously, what the hell happened to you on your way down the mountain? We must have hiked these trails a million times together, at later hours than this. We're in the middle of nowhere, in the Arizona desert. It's hardly hospitable enough for a rat to come biting on that tail you've tucked between your legs." "You didn't hear what I heard on the trail," Travis roared back, which caused his voice to come bouncing back to them from the surrounding hills in an eerie echo that left them both silent for a handful of heartbeats. "So you admit you're craving about something you heard in the trees," Eric finally scoffed, returning to his chore of sorting through their goods with his back turned. "Let me guess." An owl blinked its big eyes at you and swooped low over your head. "He probably hates your sorry excuse for music as much as I do." "It wasn't what I heard, but what I saw. What I felt," Travis growled. "You weren't there. You didn't feel how dead the trail felt. How everything froze like I'd entered a painting or something. People talk about that feeling of being watched, but it's real. There's no describing it. But it's like there's a magnifying glass above your head and you're the insect." Eric barked laughter. "What are you going on about? I never took you for such a pussy." "There was something behind the tree, watching me," Travis roared back, standing up to kick dirt in Eric's general direction. "I had the music on my phone turned all the way up, but I stepped into a pocket of static. I don't know how to describe it. It felt like a vacuum, and all the matter was being sucked out of the air around me. And people say that they know when someone's watching them, and when they look behind them, there's the guy staring. That's what happened. I looked to my left, out of instinct or some shit, and I saw the thing peeking out from behind a tree. When I pointed my flashlight at it, I saw its big bug eyes light up like reflectors, and it slinked back behind the tree." Eric finally turned to look up at his friend, but he hadn't lost his smile quite yet. "Okay, so you saw something with eyes. The number of things that fall into that category could fill a dictionary. So what?" "It was something upright. It had bony shoulders, and the hands were like claws. It wasn't human, I'm telling you. My flashlight was on it, but its skin stayed black. It almost seemed to swallow all light that touched it, except for its eyes. Man, I'm telling you, the trees in the dark, especially with shadows kicked up by a flashlight, can start playing tricks with your eyes," Eric continued.
I don't think you should be so worked up over some shadow thing in the night. It could have been an optical illusion. No! You weren't there. You didn't see it. I'm sorry I said anything. Travis sat down hard on the log, but he wasn't facing the fire. He was looking back the way he'd come, at the entrance to the hiking trail, and he was holding one of Eric's revolvers in his hands, which he'd grabbed from Eric's gear. If it'll make you feel any better, we'll both go up the trail with my lanterns, and we'll both have guns. Eric punctuated this statement by cocking the hammer back on his own .44 Magnum. Whatever creeper you saw in the trees won't stand a chance, and at best we'll come back tired and hungry. And hey, if we do bag a Bigfoot, then we'll be pioneers of the scientific community. Stop fucking around. This thing was in my head. Don't you get it? Travis snapped. It can infect the environment it's in. Get under your skin and make you feel its anger. It wasn't happy I was blasting that music. It hated I was there. And that was a warning. What do you think it'll do when I go tromping back up into its domain with a friend and weapons? You're giving this coyote way more credit than it deserves, Eric said. Coyote? Did you hear what I just said? It was standing upright. What the fuck is that? Eric followed the direction of Travis's pointing hand, surprisingly away from the hills, behind them, and up into the night sky. Eric glanced briefly up at the twinkling diamond-encrusted dome above his head and then retraced the line back to Travis's shaking arm, still upraised. What? What am I supposed to be looking at? I swear, if this is your idea of it, shut the fuck up and look! Travis burst up and pointed his gun into the sliver of sky that was troubling him, and Eric was able to pick out a star brighter than all the rest, blinking and strobing, much more prominently than its neighbors, but still in the characteristic wheelhouse of a star. Can you feel that? It's the vacuum I felt on the trail. It's sucking the air out of my lungs, tapping my energy, Travis cried. What is? The fucking star? Listen to yourself, man, Eric barked. Travis diverted from his dead stare into the night sky to shoot a mad glare Eric's way, complete with glassy, roving eyes. Look at that star and tell me it's ordinary. Eric looked again and was surprised to see that it was much brighter than before. It no longer took him a few seconds to reclaim its position in the sky, and he could swear that it was in a different place altogether, now nestled in the cradle of a different constellation, and it was strobing more violently now, robbing Eric of the blinks that he so sorely wanted to bring to this captivating stare. This established connection between him and the star that seemed to want to draw him in, pull him closer like the vacuum Travis had described. Eric managed to close his eyes, and when he looked again, the star was flashing a Christmas green. You see that, right? That's not fucking normal, Travis challenged. I mean, I've seen meteorites burn up with green light before. You think that's a fucking meteor? And now it was moving, appearing to grow in size until it was as big as any full moon on any normal, cloudless night. It is moving like a meteor, Eric said, but there was a quiver of doubt in his voice. As he spoke, he could feel the teeth rattle in his head, and the desert wind had stopped blowing across their campsite. The fire had stopped crackling. The sparks had stopped flaring. Everything had frozen except for them and the flames in the fire pit, which were slowly diminishing, the light growing ever dimmer. A crippling wave of fear overcame Eric, and it was so debilitating and heart-stopping that he could only describe it as something alien, something outside of himself that was hitting him like a tsunami, threatening to flood his lungs and carrying his rock-heavy body down to the deepest, blackest depths of the ocean. Eric was suddenly locked away in all that darkness, and he struggled to breathe, thrashing in his invisible current on his fight for life to the water's surface. It's in my head, Travis screamed. He cocked his head and lined up his sight with the ball of light in the sky, now rushing down on them like the comet it pretended to be, suddenly flashing orange, red, purple, and blue. Eric didn't even hear the gunshot as Travis unloaded his chamber into the night sky. He was too busy staring with mad fascination as the light shined its aggressive spotlight down on them, and only on them. The radiation of its light cut through their clothes. Their skin, tapping uncomfortably with the marrow of their bones. And Eric screamed with all of his life force inside his mind as its rainbow-colored radiance whitewashed his senses, separating his consciousness from his body. The fireworks! He heard Travis yell, and then he felt the explosive waves of heat from the exploding canisters of gunpowder as they ricocheted off his body and plucked at his eardrums. But still he didn't hear them, only his own childlike screaming as the light consumed the sky. spreading wings blacker than the night to cast unholy shade across their campsite. But the light from Travis's fireworks overpowered the rainbow strobe of the alien orb bearing down upon them, and they both watched it shrink back until it was the size of a basketball, held up at arm's length above their heads, just above the reach of the fireworks' blooming flower. Eric snapped out of his spell to watch Travis as he lit the fuse of the final firework and retreated a few steps with his palms clasped to his ears, and to watch the final colorful explosion light up the sky. But even before the last trickles of sparks had rained down from the spent explosion, the orb was magnifying again, snuffing out the rest of their campfire, and returning to cast its odd, blacklight luminance on their surroundings. They were defenseless now, with all their guns and fireworks proving powerless, and both Eric and Travis knew enough not to look up into the sky as the orb closed the distance between them. They only locked fearful eyes and said their last silent goodbye. But Eric registered Travis's covered ears for the first time and thought quickly, screaming at Travis to get his phone out and play his music. Travis seemed to understand what he was getting at before Eric had even finished vocalizing his final plea. He whipped out his phone and had his black metal music blaring at full volume from his phone's tinny speakers. And they watched as the light instantly swung away from them, bathing them in darkness again. And when they looked up from their coward positions on their knees, clutching each other's shoulders, the orb of light was no longer basketball-sized, but the size of a dime, streaking across the sky and over the mountain until it was out of sight or overpowered by the other star's twinkling radiance. And then they celebrated and danced in the music's heavy reverberations, and never before had Eric been so thankful to hear his friend's ear-splitting devil music. They spent the rest of the sleepless night clutching their loaded guns and taking turns holding up Travis's screaming, vibrating phone into the still night. And then dawn broke over the razor-sharp desert horizon, and Travis's phone threatened to die with 20% battery remaining. They packed up their things and hurried like they'd never hurried before, up the trail and back to their cars, keeping their heads down and their heavy metal bumping until they were safe in the parking lot. There they re-entered civilization and basked in the irritable scrutinization of the early morning hikers just arriving, and suddenly annoyed with the unsettled, unkempt energy of the teens, who had nothing better to do than defy the perfect sanctity of nature with their raucous totem of rock and roll. The garage. After making sure the door to Carl's garage was locked, his eyes flipped to his feet and he smiled. Bent down on his knees, with his right ear pressed against the floor, he could spy through the gap under the door. The first thing to catch his eye was a pile of wood, his cutting table, his mailbox in progress, and his trash can, still with the lid up. There was nothing out of the ordinary. He got onto his stomach to get a full view, straining his eye. The garage door was closed, of course, the overhead bulb still burning with life. Had he just imagined the knock from inside his garage? The boombox he'd left playing out there had died mid-play. He hadn't imagined that. There had to have been someone in there to turn it off. But it was almost midnight after all. Carl's eye was drawn to the crack in the garage's concrete wall. Something was different about it. Was it bigger? He couldn't remember there ever being so much darkness inside it. There was more vulnerability within that darkness, within that exposed void. Anything? His roommate pressed from the foot of the main parlor stairs. He was dressed in the exact same bathrobe and slippers as Carl, as if borrowed from his closet. No, something must have fallen over, Carl said. Then go out there and make sure, his roommate said, crossing and uncrossing his arms. After a moment of hesitation, they both proceeded to the living room, where the TV was on and waiting. They sat on opposite ends of the couch, all worries now forgotten. On Carl's television screen was a close-up of a red curtain strung across the frame. It was lightly fluttering. What is this? The curtain remained on screen for a long minute before it was pulled back to reveal a bird's-eye view of Carl's garage. Carl sat upright in his seat, mouth hanging open. There was a slab of wood in the center of the shot, sitting on his cutting table, and a splatter of paint was marking the floor like blood. Your house is being monitored, his roommate blurted. Carl darted back to the door, put his ear to it, and then turned to see what was happening on the TV. The image on the screen still depicted an empty garage. He figured there could still be someone hiding behind the boxes piled in one of the corners, waiting. I'm going to shove something from my pockets through the gap, Carl told his roommate. If I see it appear on the TV screen, I'll know there's really a camera in there. From his pocket, he extracted a rolled-up dollar. He unfolded it with shaky hands. And then he lowered himself to his knees and with a flick of his wrist, slid the bill into the garage. Oh God, look! Exclaimed the roommate. He didn't need to look. He knew that he was going to see the dollar, face up, as pretty as you please. How did a camera get inside my garage? Carl asked himself. The roommate looked at the television set, scanning the frame. All he could do was present Carl with his usual shrug of the shoulders. Carl's hand went for the doorknob, withdrew suddenly, and then rose again. Then his doorbell rang, followed by 3 sharp knocks. Carl froze, heart leaping into his throat, and his skin pulling taut over his face. He crooked his back and kept his head low. He wasn't surprised to see that his roommate was absent. There were more knocks, persistent. "Police, open up," said a voice from outside. Carl choked with surprise. His fingers warmed the cool surface of the doorknob as he leaned forward, his eye lining up with his peephole. There was a man on the porch, medium height with short brown hair and sideburns. He was wearing a blue uniform, black stripes running down his pant legs and arms. A badge glinted from his breast, one of his hands planted on the butt of his gun. Carl relaxed a notch, but his heart continued to race. The cop's head reared into the direction of the peephole, the reflection of Carl's door shimmering in his wide eyes. A smile spread over his face, revealing a mouthful of razor-sharp teeth, resembling those of a shark. A thin drop of blood trickled from one of his nostrils, curving along the line of his upper lip. With his eyes shut, Carl backed away from the door. He shook his head a few times, his dark thoughts rattling inside his skull, breaking apart and dispersing to opposite ends. He couldn't shake the image no matter how hard he tried. It remained burned into his retinas, a silvery ghost. With a second look, the cop was now looking at the ground, a frown lightly tracing his lips. He was free of blood. "What is the problem?" Carl asked. "Why don't we talk?" the man responded. "Open the door and we'll straighten this out." The cop's voice was different somehow, almost smoother. It had a relaxed feel to it, urbane, without care or apprehension. "Open the door, Mr. Ford," the man insisted. Carl retrieved a hammer from a kitchen cupboard and took hold of the doorknob again. With the tool behind his back, he cracked open the door, just enough for him to poke his head out. At first he saw the policeman, upright and poised on his front porch, but in a flash, the face of the man was bathed in darkness, and his eyes turned gray. Blood enveloped his features, splattered in ugly, clotted streaks, or trickling freely from infected sores. He had 2 peeling lips, cracked and bloated over miniature shark teeth. Discolored skin was stretched tight over his projecting cheekbones and nose. He had white strings of hair that clustered in patches on his lumpy head, like collective weeds. The thing on Carl's front porch no longer had sideburns, brown hair, or a gun hooked on a leather belt. Before Carl was death. Carl screamed, throwing the door open the rest of the way. He presented his enemy an upraised hand, wielding a hammer. The creature smiled, the eyes in its skull rolling away into their whites. It seemed to pivot its head toward the hammer, welcoming Carl to swing into its open face. The hammer connected with the monster's jaw, throwing its head backward with a sickening crunch. The creature shrieked, enormous jets of blood pulsing from a gash in its face, its cheekbone just visible. The monster hit the concrete path, gargling and spitting up blood. Carl stepped out into the night, eyes on fire, and his mouth stretched wide. The sweaty strands of his hair hung across his eyes, throwing shadows over his features. The cloaked figure seemed to laugh at him through its broken face, gray eyes bugging out of their sockets. Carl buried the head of his hammer into one of those eyes, which broke open in a rush of translucent fluid. The creature went still. Carl didn't bother trying to yank the hammer out of the eye socket, not when it sat so rigid in the monster's skull. Carl sat on his front stoop, trying to regain his breath with his eyes closed and his fingers massaging his brow. He found he couldn't wipe the smile from his face. He bounded to his feet, taking a moment to inspect his kill. What he saw froze every muscle in his body and curdled his blood. Though the monster's face wasn't discernible, the blood-splattered police uniform did not lie. Carl bent closer to the man and lightly placed his fingers on the officer's badge. Oh God, no, fuck! He tried to get up but fell into the rock pit by his porch. He was leaning against the outside wall, gripping the brick with his nails and his arms wobbling. When he noticed the police cruiser parked at his curb, he fell over again, his world spinning. Oh shit, oh my God. Carl staggered back into his house, trying to wipe the drying blood off his forearms and neck. He followed one of the walls to his living room, where he collapsed onto his couch, legs still trembling like pieces of plucked string. There was a definitive urge to vomit in all of this dizziness, which he eased by gulping ravenously at the air. My God. He closed his eyes, burying his face into the cushion of his couch. What the fuck did you do? Carl repositioned his head to look at the roommate, who stood rigid as a statue, hands working knots into his hair. Never before had he seen his roommate's eyes so wide and glassy. Never before had Carl seen himself so petrified. There's a body in front of your house, and it's a cop, the roommate announced, pacing circles across the room. Jesus Christ, Carl, there's a cop car parked outside. You don't need to tell me this, Carl curled into a fetal ball. Oh, I'm so fucked. Stop stammering. We'll figure something out, the roommate said. He didn't look up from the floor. We'll bring him inside. We'll find a place to put him for now. Carl suddenly felt like he was falling and he sprang off the couch, hitting the carpet with a muffled thud. "You fucked up, man," the roommate cried, hovering over Carl's sprawled body. When he rolled over, the roommate was already gone, headed for the exit. "We have to drag him in. Get out here!" Carl only lay there, burying his hot face into the rug. He was muttering inaudible words under his breath, the room a revolving wheel under his dead weight. "Fine, man, you can wallow in your own mess," the roommate shouted from across the room. Then he was only another shadow on the wall. "Wait!" He gripped the couch cushions for support, hauling his body away from the floor. Spittle ran down his chin in sequin threads as he lurched for the front door. Outside he could hear the call of the crickets and the distant bark of some dog. He poked his head out into the night. There was the corpse. His heart sank. He remembered the cop car parked at his curb and his stomach sank with it. "I'll grab the legs. I'll just drag him inside. Clean the hammer," Carl explained to the crickets. "We can't have a messy hammer." With a face pulled back in disgust, he reached for the cop's pointed shoes. He took him by the ankles and pulled. There was a handgun lying in the lawn, cocked and ready. In reality, the policeman had been unholstering his weapon, about to fire. Carl had killed an armed officer using a simple tool. He'd been that close to taking a bullet between the eyes. He had cheated death. Without thought, Carl lugged the body over the steps and onto the porch. Grunting and perspiring, he dragged the corpse into the house. He darted outside to collect the gun, and in a flash, he was back indoors, locking the door behind him. Carl glanced down at the body, the hammer still wedged inside the eye socket. He got down on his knees and unsnapped the cop's belt. Laid it neatly at the front of the stairs, holstering the gun into its appropriate compartment. Something familiar caught his eye. A wallet was protruding from the man's front pocket. Carl pulled it out and inspected the ID inside. It was Carl's wallet. "Dropped the damn thing. When I was looking for my spare key, that's how the cop knew my name," he concluded, shaking his head. He started to chuckle lightly under his breath. "He picked up my wallet, that's all." "I'm glad you think this is funny," the roommate snapped from behind him. "Do you realize what you did?" I know, all right. "So what's the plan?" "Does it look like I have a plan?" Carl shot back, standing up to face his counterpart. "I have nothing. If you think of something, let me know." "Well," Carl read his double's face, but could not decipher anything in his own features. "We have to get rid of it, of course," said the roommate. "How do you propose to do that?" "We have to make the body look unrecognizable," the roommate whispered. "It's easier to fix this if there are several pieces." "You gotta be fucking kidding me," Carl said. "Let's strip the body. Come on, hurry." They both hovered over the man, the audible silence only adding weight onto each of their shoulders. The cop's shirt and vest landed in a pile next to the belt, followed by his shoes and pants. The naked man lay across Carl's wooden floor like a fallen star. "Let's take him to the garage," the roommate said. He took both of the officer's wrists. Carl grabbed the ankles and they both lifted at the same time. "Wait, hold on," Carl said before dropping his end. The body hit the floor with a heavy thud. The roommate jumped away, face screwed up in fury. "What the hell is wrong with you?" the roommate cried. After several tries to even wrap his fingers around the hammer, Carl finally took hold of it and yanked hard. It came out of the man's face with a sickening crunch. He let the hammer spin out of his wet palm, throwing himself against the far wall. The roommate bent down to pick it up with his thumb and forefinger. He offered it to Carl. Red beads ran off its steel head like drops of rainwater. Carl nodded and took it by the handle, slowly pulling open the door into his garage. At first he kept it ajar and paused for a long moment, heart thumping. Then he threw it open the rest of the way. He looked up at the ceiling where he found no camera or any conspicuous holes for one to hide. There was nothing but the flickering light bulb. When he peered back into the living room, the TV was off. "Be careful," said the roommate. Once inside the garage, he was sure that the crack in the wall was larger. It stretched from one end of the corner to the other, bits of concrete scattered on the floor. He dragged the body inside and placed it beside the cutting table. With his hands free, he strode over to the wall and scoped out the fissure with his fingers. It was cool and dank, like the air inside a tomb. "Why is it bigger?" Carl asked his counterpart. The roommate only shrugged. "That's where I belong. That's where I hide, along with a lot of other things. The crack didn't always used to be there. Sometimes it's good that you have a crack, because that allows me to come and go as I please. Sometimes it's better not to be alone. But if the crack gets too big and the wall comes down, nothing will be safe. What happens then? I figure you'll go insane." There were heavy footsteps on the floor above them. They both whirled around and the hammer went sliding from Carl's limp fingers. The steel head struck his toe and he went lurching back. His heel caught the leg of the officer, and before he knew it, he was falling through time and space. His other half watched him with wide eyes, his hands just stretching out to him. Everything was in slow motion as he plummeted, even though it was all unfolding in the matter of a second. The door into the house flew open in a burst of hot air. and something invisible was dragging the roommate away from Carl. He was wrenched over the steps and through the doorway, his limbs thrashing, his face a terrible mask of terror and panic. His fingers caught the door frame briefly before they slipped away. The door began to swing shut. Through the gap in the closing door, Carl saw something black and ominous come cascading down his staircase as a storm cloud. From within its darkness, Carl was sure he caught a glimpse of 2 gray eyes. Carl hit the garage floor just as the door latched. From the other side came screams of agony, and they were his own. His skull bounced off the concrete, his vision now a sparkling tapestry of green streaks and black circles. He turned his face, his fingers grasping blindly at the air. The garage was far off, only a postage stamp in an otherwise black abyss. The face of the cop swam back into semi-focus, his blank eyes blinking rapidly, his lips curling into a smirk. Carl was screaming, but it was only in his head. The face of the corpse drained back into nothing, leaving Carl to his tumble into eternity. Before his eyes closed and locked shut, Carl saw the crack floating above him, yellow light flooding out and bathing his face. Even as he fell, he saw that the crack was widening into a deep crevice, the light dwindling and flickering in the darkness. "I figure you'll go insane." There was a brief pause in life and breath. Then a red velvet curtain fell over his vision, shrouding all light, all conception. "I'm all right. No problem. Why can't I push past this damn curtain? Am I dead? Could that have killed me? Help me! I shouldn't have taken that much. I should have stayed in my comfort zone. Too much. Oh shit, oh god, it's so cold, so hard. I had a hard run running from the wind. If I could just... Am I dead? Am I dead? I need to... Maybe I can... Hello? Help me!" Carl's eyes flew open, and he convulsed beside the dead body, repeating no, no, no under his breath. Everything was a blur. The overhead light only a yellow streak like the tail of a comet. If he would have turned to the far wall, he would have seen that the crack had spread to the ceiling, the darkness swirling like the organic shape on the stairs. "My son, I need... Who's the man?" Carl asked himself in a distant voice, a grin alive on his face. "Kudos, my friend, kudos." He crawled across the floor, his head hanging between his shoulders, his palms slapping the concrete. He found a wall and was on his feet, lurching forward. All the while his feet lagged and laughter coursed out of his throat and into his open mouth. He flapped his arms at his side as he passed through the door. His walls were breathing and doors all over the house were slamming. His stairs stretched into eternity, the black mass looming at the very top. "Hey, sunshine," Carl said with a laugh. "Are you ready to talk?" the voice asked him. "What do you want?" Carl screamed. "You really thought you could avoid me?" the thing asked. "My roommate. Gone. You're alone now." "Come fucking get me," Carl challenged, throwing his head back with a ripple of jagged laughter. "I can't. You have to come to me." "Show yourself." "Turn around." The mirror from his garage was now hanging on his front door. Without any hesitation, Carl ran at it and thrust his head into the liquid glass. On the other side, Death sat on a stool, his legs crossed under his dark robe. His pale, scabbed face stood out in the gray wash of the background, eyes piercing Carl like pins. "You must finish what you've begun." "What did I begin?" "Make the body unrecognizable, and then retrieve your key. I'll do the rest." Death nodded his head, flaps of skin waving. A hole in his cheek revealed a row of sharp teeth and the decaying sponge of his tongue. "Key." Death nodded again. Carl pulled his head out of the mirror, and he passed through the floor this time and burrowed into his garage. Eyes in the walls watched Carl as he heaved the body onto the cutting table. Flowers bobbed on his floor, his bike bucked like an angry bull, and the dragonflies buzzed along the ceiling. All his friends were coming out to say hello one last time. From behind him, the crack in his wall grew, debris raining down on his head. The boombox suddenly came alive to play the very last song on the album. The saw buzzed into life in his palm. The bandsaw buzzed into life in his palm. Blood was splattering, his eyes were closed. There was the crack of bone, the rip of tendons. "I don't tell. The moon doesn't light, it only reflects," the saw screamed. "I'm an artist. This is my greatest work." The garage echoed with Carl's laughter. "It's time," Death roared. A plank of wood resembling a key stood out amidst the spinning wheel of Carl's garage. There was a keyhole punched into the floor, just wide enough for the piece of wood. Carl found the key in all the chaos, which was now painted pitch black. He grasped it with both hands and turned it inside the lock. There was a metallic click from somewhere inside the garage, and the door began its ascent up its track. Blue and red light bathed Carl's floor as the door crawled. There was the unmistakable roar of applause and the screech of an electric guitar. Carl started to laugh again, holding his chest, unable to shut his stinging eyes. He couldn't repress his bubbling joy, his utmost surprise and realization. "Thank you, this is a great place," an amplified voice declared from the stage. "We hate to see it go, that's for sure." The heavy red and blue spotlights filled Carl's senses, filled them to the brim. The end doesn't have to be a bad thing, Carl. Carl stepped out of the garage, clapping his hands. He disappeared into the tight squeeze of body parts and compressed air. The happiest man on earth. This one's for all of you! They jumped into the next song, the approval of the audience far surpassing the music. He was falling again. The whole way down, he heard the song of the dead. Epilogue. To be a fly on that wall. What a fucking mess, Miller said through a cloud of smoke. Bear? Dead? Can you fucking believe this? He took another distracted drag off his cigarette before flicking it to the driveway. His eyes briefly washed over the pickup truck, then back to the scene. It was only a disturbance call, Connor said from the curb. A neighbor just heard some loud yelling. At the most, Bear would have given the guy a warning. So what happened? Body parts littered the floor, now painted red. The electric saw lay beneath the cutting table. If Miller reached down to touch its blade, he would find it to still be warm. Officer Bear's upper body was draped across the table, his head barely hanging onto the neck. He was shirtless, his rib cage poking out beneath a deep slit in his chest. Miller chose to ignore the insides revealed below the ribs. The arms were at opposite ends of the garage, the severed legs stacked against one of the walls like timber. In the corner, leaning on the same wall, was the resident of the house, Carl Ford. His head propped up on his shoulder. His eyes were closed, lips slack in an expression of peace. Blood spotted his robe and stained his lap. Was this suicide? Connor asked Miller. I can't say right now, but Miller pointed out Carl's left arm, dormant in his lap. Half of the hand was missing, separated at the knuckles, leaving only the thumb. He knew that if he poked around the garage, he would find those lost fingers, pale and shriveled. Was it an accident? Miller shrugged, hitching up his pants. I'd say the death was from loss of blood. Maybe he got a little too careless as he chopped up the body. Why would this guy do something like this? To cut up a body with a handsaw is sick enough, Connor said, but why? Miller could only shake his head. The witness is here if you'd like to ask any questions, an officer told the pair. The witness was a young woman standing in the street, a preteen boy clinging to her nightgown. She stood in front of her son to block the open garage and its gruesome scene from his young eyes. Thank you, Connor said, making his way toward the woman. He shook her hand and gave the boy a warm smile. The kid returned it with a shy glance. So, what can you tell us, Mrs. Humphrey, she said, placing an arm around her son's shoulder. I live across the street, and earlier tonight, maybe around 7 or 8, I heard something from outside. It took me a while to realize that it was a man screaming. Then I heard a door slam, hard. When I looked outside, no one was around, but I could tell the noise was coming from that house there. I could see shadows in the windows, but I couldn't quite make them out. Did you think he was in trouble? Connor asked. Of course, screaming like that was enough to turn my blood cold, Mrs. Humphrey said with a shiver. She pulled her robe close around her slender figure, brushing the bangs from her eyes. I could also hear loud music, but he was always playing his music loud. So you called the police thinking Mr. Ford was in some kind of trouble? Yes. Then what? I forgot about it for a while, and I finally looked out my window to see the cop car parked outside his house. I just figured they were inside talking and everything was fine. I forgot about it again, and before going to bed, I peeked outside and the cop car was still there. I thought it odd that the cops should be there for that long, so I called you guys again. Right, Connor concluded. Anything else? Mrs. Humphrey shook her head, trying to avert her eyes from the inside of the garage. Connor could tell the boy was trying to cock his head around his mother's waist to better see the crime scene. Don't take this the wrong way, but should your son be outside right now? Connor asked, stepping into the kid's line of sight. I almost forgot. This might be important, Mrs. Humphrey said. My son has some information that may be worth hearing. Go ahead, David. The boy kicked at the ground, still staring at his feet. What is it, son? Connor asked. The light from the lamppost shifted and left jagged shadows across the boy's round face. His eyes were like black holes. I was playing in the street and I heard Mr. Ford talking pretty loud inside his garage, the kid began. It sounded like he was talking to someone, which is weird, because I know he lives alone. I listened for a while and I didn't hear anyone else say anything, so I thought I'd have some fun. I knocked on his garage door a few times and ran home. He'd always yell after me, so I knew he was pretty mad. Thank you, David. That does help, Connor said, ruffling the boy's hair. Take your son to bed, Mrs. Humphrey. It's past midnight, and he needs his sleep. Good night, officer, she said, escorting her son back across the street. So would you say that Mr. Ford was an ordinary guy? Connor called after her. She stopped and turned, only a silhouette in the darkness. Yeah, real quiet, though, except for the music. He really liked his rock and roll. She continued into the house with her son. Did she shed any more light on this? Miller asked his partner. Well, maybe. Apparently the boy heard Mr. Ford talking to someone in his garage. Did the kid hear anyone other than Mr. Ford? No. He described it like he was talking to himself. Of course, there could have been someone here earlier. We'll just have to follow up on anything we can. Why do you think Ford was screaming? What the hell happened tonight? Miller asked. I don't know. I really don't, Connor answered. They both stepped into the garage where a few men in gloves and dust masks were snapping photos and sorting through the debris. The smell hit the officers first and their hands went to cup their nostrils. Connor scanned the floor hastily and spotted an odd shape of wood, painted jet black, lying at Ford's feet. He didn't give it a second thought. Trash littered the floor and a boombox lay smashed across the concrete. Forgotten nearby was a CD, spotted red with blood. He turned to face the nearest wall where a small crack, the size of his pinky, lined 4 inches of the wall. Cold air blew out of it, barely tickling the hair on Connor's beard. He peered into the crack, the breeze wafting over him. There was a shapeless darkness swirling beyond that wall, endless and restless. Connor tore himself away and locked eyes with Miller, who hovered over the cutting table, his face screwed up in disgust. I'm going to step inside for a minute, Connor told him. He dodged into Mr. Ford's house, trying to escape the awful stench. Set at the foot of the stairs was a police uniform, neatly folded. Next to the pile was Jerome Bear's belt, the gun still holstered. He strode over to the front door and paused there for a long moment, eyeing it with a growing interest. There was a poster hastily taped to the door, crooked and sagging. It was of Jerry Garcia, his guitar slung over one shoulder, his right arm upraised. Connor lightly touched the poster and his stomach turned. He vomited onto the floor. From beyond the crack in the garage wall, a ghostly voice, no human ears could hear, sang. Bloody Mary, you have my child. When Joni awoke, it was 9:58. She looked over at her digital clock. She jumped up from her bed and ran out of her room, stopping at the bathroom. She opened the door and carefully edged for the light switch. She expected a cold, clammy hand to wrap around hers, then pull her in. She found the switch and flipped it. The bathroom was in tip-top shape. Everything was in the order her mother had put it in. She took out a bobby pin that would aid in her plan. She reached for the doorknob and locked it from the outside. The alarm clock setting on the counter turned to 10 o'clock. She had to hurry. She took the bobby pin out of the lock. Joni closed the door and headed for her room. But what seemed like 10 seconds after closing that door, she heard the cracking of glass and the small thump of footsteps on the linoleum. Once Joni reached the door to her bedroom, she looked back. The doorknob was rattling back and forth. She felt fear wash over her like a bucket of ice-cold water. She had to get out of the house, but found it was too late. A long, bony finger with a sharp yellow nail protruded from the keyhole and twisted sideways with a small click. The finger recoiled and the door started to open slowly. Joni ran into her room and slammed the door behind her. She put her back to it, eyes closed, praying soundlessly. Outside, she could hear the soft creaking of the carpet. It was corrupting. Joni could hardly breathe. She knew it was coming, she knew. Then the footsteps ceased. The doorknob shook, but Joni had the handle on it. There was a tenuous push on the door again, but Joni still had her broad shoulder propped up against it. This time the door was hit with strong force that caused Joni to step back a bit, but that made her push harder against the door. It came again, only stronger. This time the door even opened, introducing a wicked, rotting odor. Joni pushed back, slamming the door. She started to cry, tears rolling down her cheeks. She needed something to prop up against it. She looked over to see her computer chair close to her flexing foot. She slid her foot under the bottom of it and dragged it closer. The door flung open again, but Joni just pushed back, closing it again. She grabbed the chair with her free hand and pushed it under the doorknob. She made sure it was secure before jumping back onto her bed, but the chair held the door in place. She looked over at her digital clock. It was 10:04. Just one more minute. She looked at the carpet. Blood, streamers of it, were seeping under the crack. The chair was rocking back and forth and blood was dripping out from the keyhole. Then the digital clock turned to 10:05. Joni looked back at the door, but there was no more movement. She could distinctly hear someone step into the bathroom. Then the door slammed, the lock clicking. She put her face into her hands. This was going to happen every night. But how could she keep doing this? She lay face down under bed, struggling with a breath that threatened not to come. A week later, Joni snuck out of her house and went to the park. It was 9:39, and soon she would be visited again. Joni sat down in a swing, her head in her hands. 10:05, Mary checked her own watch, her arm shaking slightly. Nothing happened. Okay, I can go home now, Joni said shakily. They both got up and started to their homes. In the pure darkness, Mary could see Joni's pale white skin. It was milky, and it made Mary's skin tingle. It was like sharing the sidewalk with a ghost. Then Mary reached the street corner that would lead to her house, but Joni grabbed her arm. Mary wished she hadn't because the grasp was icy and felt like rubber. She hadn't cut her nails for a while, and they were digging into Mary's skin. Walk me to my house? She asked. Mary and Joni made their way to Joni's house, which was on the opposite corner. Mary looked over at her. She was literally quaking with cold mixed with fear. If Joni was telling the truth, she was truly in hell. Then sirens broke the awkward silence, followed by a plume of smoke that covered the sky. Then there were yells of desperate and frantic men. Joni and Mary exchanged worried looks before Joni took off in a stumbling sprint. "Joni!" Mary yelled, running after her, slippers flipping away from her feet. Rocks, bits of gravel, and what seemed like a rusty nail cut through her feet. Mary squinged in pain, but kept running until she was around the bend to see Joni's house at the end of the corner, or what was left of Joni's house. It was swallowed in flames, firemen trying their best to keep the inferno down. Joni was running toward the house, yelling frantically, but 2 firemen grabbed her by each arm and held her down. Joni fought back, tears flooding out of her open eyes. Mandy stepped into her freshly painted house, slipping off her backpack. "I'm home," she called, but her mom was most likely working and her dad was probably out on an important meeting. She sat down on the couch, not bothering to do her homework. She was too preoccupied with all that was happening. Mandy turned on her TV and started to stare into it, getting lost. TV always helped her with things that troubled her. Also, Joni helped with those kinds of things, but Joni seemed like she needed a little help too. Mandy lunged for the phone, but then thought she wouldn't be at Mary's yet. She didn't even know where Mary lived. She huffed a sigh of disappointment. Mandy slouched into her chair, waiting for a phone call. "Come on, Mary, don't keep me waiting like this," she thought to herself. Joni was her best friend of all these years. She did not believe in ghosts or any kind of supernatural things, but there was something about the way Joni was behaving the past few days. She had been through a lot. All of a sudden, a dark figure passed through the room, which made her screech out in horror. Joni was lying on the floor in front of her, with a knife driven into her head. Then the phone rang and Mandy bolted out of her sleep. It was nighttime and a blanket was wrapped around her. Mandy snatched the phone and set it to her ear. "Hello?" she said sourly into the phone. "Mandy, turn your clock to 10, Joni's voice said on the other side. "Why?" "So I can come to get you. All of you, especially Joni. You'll all fall into temptation." It was a woman's voice now. Then blood spurted out of the phone, drenching her. She burst up from her couch, sleep still on her, when she hit the ground. She then snapped her eyes open. It was just a dream. She was on the floor, breathing hard. Just a dream. The clock on the wall said it was 5:42, so she had been sleeping for some time. Her parents still weren't home, but she wasn't worried about that. They usually came home around 6. Still, Mary hadn't even called, and Mandy was worried about that. Mandy went into the kitchen to find the butcher knife lying neatly on the kitchen counter. That hadn't been like that a few hours ago, or had it? Mandy walked quickly out of the kitchen and slowly went into the bathroom. She ran the water, cupping her hands, and she caught a pool of it to slosh on her face. Then she leaned over the sink. She looked up to see her crisp reflection in the wall-high mirror. She wiped her face and fixed her hair in front of it. She went to leave when something made her stop and look back into the mirror. She remembered Joni's party, where Joni had said the chant in front of the mirror. No Bloody Mary, she said, smiling. Mandy frowned. She touched the mirror thoughtfully. She then closed the door and locked it. Mandy put her finger to the light switch for a second, still looking at her shuddering reflection. Then the bathroom went black. Mandy stared blindly into the darkness, trying to calm down. She let out a little frightened squeak before reciting the chant. When she was finished, she added, "Bloody Mary, I have your child." By then, she was bolder and sure that she was safe. Darkness, silence. Nothing was happening. She let out a low, relieved sigh before reaching for the light switch. Crack, crack. Mandy's hand stopped in midair, her head pounding. The mirror was cracking. Mandy leapt for the door, but she couldn't go any farther than a slight shuffle. She started to panic. Then Mandy froze, eyes fixed on the darkened mirror. A blue woman, dressed in a long robe, stood behind a slightly illuminated Mandy. The woman was covered in pouring blood. Her eyes were white, and her mouth was twisted in a horrid frown. Mandy started to moan as a hand rose up and rested on her shoulder. Nails sunk down into her skin. Then she was thrust backward, and she was slashed across the spine with a long bladed cane. Mandy's body writhed back and forth as she was slashed and stabbed. Mandy was still screaming until the butt of the cane came down into her mouth, knocking out all her front teeth. The glowing woman frowned throughout the whole process, eyes never leaving Mandy. The blade of the scepter was thrust into Mandy's intestines, causing a streamer of blood to squirt across the bathroom wall. Mandy then was thrust forward, face first into the floor, smashing the top of her skull, and then Bloody Mary picked the semi-dead Mandy up by the collar and dropped her backward onto the bathroom counter. Her head smashed into the mirror, finishing her off. Her eyes rolled back and her head lolled to the side. Then Bloody Mary was simply gone, leaving a blood-stained bathroom and a bleeding corpse to go with it. All this happened in 30 seconds. Then the phone started to ring and ring until it got the voicemail. "Hi, Mandy, I guess I called at the wrong time. Joni's okay, she's right here. We had a bit of a scare, but no big deal. Okay, I'll call back. Bye," said Mary. Right at that very second, Mandy's parents walked in the house together. "Well, she didn't pick up," Mary said, turning towards Joni, who was curled up in Mary's bed. They were both in Mary's room, both counting down to 10 o'clock. Mary was sitting at her desk right in front of a huge mirror. Joni was looking at the mirror, watching her reflection, her withering, dying one. "Joni, did you hurt yourself when you fainted?" Mary asked worriedly. "No," Joni said. "My dad's really worried," Mary said. "Lose the mirror," Joni replied. "What?" "I can't sleep in this room. It has a mirror." Mary looked back at it. She could see Joni shuddering in the glass. She was convinced that Bloody Mary was tearing her world apart. "Well, when our guest room's ready, you can sleep down there," Mary replied, looking back over at Joni. "4 more hours," Joni said, ignoring Mary completely. Mary sat back, secretly wanting Bloody Mary to take her away from all this complication, yet Joni too was wishing the same thing. Mary left to go to the bathroom, and when she got back to the room, she turned the knob savagely. Locked. Mary twisted the knob again. "Joni, come on, let me in," Mary yelled. No response. Mary slammed against the door, yelling for Joni to open. "Is everything okay?" Mr. Jacobs yelled up at Mary. "Yes, fine," Mary lied. Mary turned back to the door and bent down to look through the keyhole. Mary gasped. The room was in a mess. Joni was against the opposite wall of the mirror, writhing around like she was being slapped. The mirror was pouring down blood, flooding a river of red over Mary's white carpet. Mary extracted a pin from her hair and stuck it into the lock. She turned and spun it around until she heard a click. She swung open the door and gasped again. Joni was lying in the corner, shivering fiercely. The room was in perfect order, and the mirror was back to its clean self. The carpet was no longer bloodstained. Mary, she somehow got through the mirror. She will kill me if I sleep in here," Joni stuttered. I just saw this room and you being torn apart. What do you mean?" Mary said, running towards Joni to help. "She came out. She would have killed me. Her eyes," Joni sobbed. Mary led Joni out of the room, trying to ignore the freezing temperature. Mary and Joni sat down in her sister Katie's room to talk, but Joni just rolled over to her side. Mary got up and put a blanket around Joni's shoulders, but her friend didn't close her eyes, not even to blink. Mary passed her room but closed the door, still thinking of the room she saw through the keyhole. She didn't even think she could sleep in it anymore. She didn't want to leave Joni alone, so she went into the computer room right next to Katie's room. She turned on the computer to play some solitaire. She couldn't stop thinking of Mandy and the way she looked at Mary before she walked home. Mary had even promised to Mandy she would call her. Mary thought that maybe if she had called just a few minutes earlier, Mandy might still be alive. Mary leaned back in her chair. In the room alone, Joni spoke to herself. "It's the reflection in the mirror. It's the blood on the glass." Joni's body twitched suddenly from Katie's bedroom floor, foam starting to drop from her chin. 9 o'clock, Joni said, right as the clock in Katie's room turned to 9. That night, Mary fell asleep in the computer room, and Joni was absent from Katie's bedroom floor. Come to think of it, Mary's father didn't even think twice as to why Joni spent every night locked in the basement from 10 to waking hours. He was a little worried why he would find a new crack in the bathroom mirror each night. Mary herself was sleeping down on the couch instead of her room all that week. She kept thinking of what Joni had said about Bloody Mary in her bedroom mirror. Mary's father was worried of that as well. Joni, though, slept down in the basement, the door locked. Sleep was not the right word, though. She would just huddle in the corner, eyes wide and glassy. When she rarely did fall asleep, she would dream of Mandy being thrown into a shattering mirror by a blood-stained arm. Joni would then wake up in a cold sweat, only to get up to get ready for another day, even if it was 1 o'clock in the morning. Then Mary would wake up to her alarm clock to find a pale Joni, dressed in her regular clothes and backpack, staring down at her. "Good morning, Mary," Joni would say coolly every morning. "Ready for the day to come?" The next 2 weeks were horrible for Mary and Joni. Night after night, as Mary slept on the couch, she could feel a cold draft pass by her huddled figure. She would always wrap her blanket over her head and try not to breathe hard. Mary would even hear footsteps pass right by the couch and down the hall. This would always happen at 10 o'clock. Mary would then listen intently as the basement door down the hall rattled and banged around. This is, of course, where Joni slept each night. The door would just keep rattling silently at first, and then to a point where Mary thought her family would wake up. They never did, though. Some nights, Mary just wanted to jump up and run, but she had no idea of what the outcome would be. Right when Mary thought she was about to go mad, the rattling would stop and the cold breeze rushed by again. Sometimes Mary would hear the patter of blood on the carpet or the heavy wheezing of something. It was always 10:05. When Mary finally did wake up from her horrific nightmares, she would find no blood on the carpet, but there would always be a pale Joni waiting for her. The girls weren't doing so well either. They were all mourning the death of Mandy. They couldn't understand how Joni showed no emotion or compassion for Mandy. Joni would just sit silently in class, staring at the blackboard and whispering under her breath. The girls were also worried for Mary because, just like Joni, she wasn't getting too much sleep and was becoming incredibly silent. Mary was also falling asleep a lot during class, which always led her straight to the principal's office. Her father was disappointed and worried. Mary was usually such a good girl, but she had been going through a lot, yet he really didn't have any idea. Bloody Mary, I am your child. Joni crouched down low to the curb. not opening her eyes. She didn't hear any more laughing, but there was far-away crackling that seemed to start in the pit of her ears. Then it stopped altogether, making Joni relax a bit. She summoned up the remaining shred of her courage and snapped open her eyes in one swift motion. Nothing. The street was empty and she was on the sidewalk. She lifted up her aching body and managed to get to her bloody, bruised feet. The hammer she had dropped was lying in the middle of the street. Joni whimpered, questioning if it was okay to move from her spot. She decided and quickly limped into the street and snatched up her one source of protection. She shuddered and crossed her arms as a cold breeze lifted and came down across the street. Joni started to get scared, so she began to return to the curb. Then the breeze twisted and twirled around her in one soulless wisp. 2 clear red eyes appeared in front of her, not wielding any kind of facial appearance. Just 2 thin staring eyes only constructed out of the blowing wind. The eyes seemed to smile at Joni as if mocking her, drowning her in remorse. Then the laughing started again. The fierce evil laughter of a woman. It seemed to come from the eyes, as if the black pupils were gaping mouths, reacting to some sick joke. Joni staggered backwards, arms twirling outwards for balance. The eyes seemed to follow her, though, with every step. Joni knew exactly whose eyes they were, Bloody Mary's. Somehow Bloody Mary was actually there, in no reliable form in front of her. This, Joni knew, was not her mental mind constructing this. Bloody Mary was actually there. She had the same feeling of dread on that day in Mary's room in front of her mirror. Joni screamed, falling backwards. The eyes closed, into nothing, and the ravenous wind blew off into the mini tornado, leaving Joni lying in the middle of the street. Her chest heaved and her head was spinning. She's getting stronger, Joni thought. The mirror. Mary's mirror is her transportation. She's getting stronger because of that. The mirror. Let's get back to Black Spruce, Joni proclaimed, getting back to her feet. Must warn Mary. Then sirens blew through the air like an elephant's roar. Joni stopped dead in her tracks as patrol cars lined the street and halted at Joni's feet. Police got out and aimed their handguns carefully at the delirious young girl. Joni, put down your weapon and step towards me, a broad cop said as he slowly approached Joni. His gun was in the holster, and that gave Joni the idea that no force was going to be used. Joni dropped the murder weapon. So be it. Joni stepped into the man's arms and handcuffs were casually slapped onto her wrists. The clock struck 9:41. Joni wrapped her white, bony fingers around the cold steel bars of the jail door. She had been brought down to the Glenwood Springs police station where there was a lone jail cell to keep intoxicated men for the night. But tonight it was to keep a 17-year-old girl. The deputy was sitting behind his assigned desk, feet kicked up, old western leather boots on, and a coffee mug sitting atop a stack of old worthless forms. He looked straight at the girl with interest. A 17-year-old girl, killing her own friend brutally with a hammer? It just didn't seem probable, but it did happen. And that's when Barry's job became an illness. It just made him upset to think about all the evil and loony people there were out there. Sir, what time is it? Joni asked, worriedly, shivering under the blanket that had been provided her. Girl, please, go to sleep. When you wake up, we'll decide then what to do with you, Barry replied, leaning back his head and closing his eyelids. Please, then I'll sleep. Barry grunted and raised his meaty arm like it was a back-breaking chore. He gazed at his watch intently and then turned his attention back to Joni. It's 9:56. Now go to bed. He relaxed again into his chair. Joni stepped back and then racked her brain for some kind of escape plan, but no such plan could ever be constructed. She gave up on that and looked at the wall above Barry's head. A small mirror in the shape of an oval hung from the wall. It was used by police who were around the corner so they could look at the mirror and see the reflection of the cell. It was much easier than completely turning the corner. If there was only some way to smash the glass, but that wasn't a possible plan either. So then she started to plead, beg for her escape. Please, sir, you've got to let me out. If you don't, you could really get hurt, Joni said desperately. Shut up, Barry yelled without opening his eyes. Please, you have to, Joni screamed, banging her fists on the bars. Don't make me drug you, girl, Barry said. Joni fell back into her spring-loaded cot. She hung her head and waited for the time to come. Barry's watch struck 10 o'clock, and immediately a wide crack slashed across the mirror. Barry jumped up from his chair and turned his head towards the mirror, which was now dripping blood. Joni was staring too, and she skirted to the very edge of the bed, her back resting on the concrete wall. What the? Barry asked fearfully. Then, long, razor-sharp nails dug into his shoulder and pulled him back onto the desk, scattering the paperwork and the full mug of coffee. He looked up and then screamed. A blood-stained woman with a blue flowing gown stood before him. He pulled out his gun with no hesitation, but Bloody Mary was quicker. The blade of her mother's scepter came through the air like a boomerang and separated a piece of Barry's stomach from his waist. Joni screamed, fingers digging into the wall until her fingernails popped right off her fingers in a string of blood. Bloody Mary turned her head towards the cowering Joni with her blank white eyes. Her torn purple lips peeled into a breathless smile, revealing black, molding teeth. She laughed quickly, letting black blood drip off her gaping hole of a mouth. Bloody Mary snatched the keys to the cell off the hook without even looking at them. She stopped at the cell door and jammed the key into the keyhole. Joni stopped screaming now, but terror was still scraping at the walls of her heart. The woman passed through the cell doors and smiled happily down upon Joni. "I've waited a long time for this," Bloody Mary began, but her dead, dreary voice kept trailing off and coming back into focus again. Joni cocked her head upwards as Bloody Mary's bleeding hands brought up the cobra-shaped scepter. The long, double-edged blade at the end gleamed red as it dropped slowly downward. Joni had time to see her whole life pass before her eyes and to say her last words, "So be it." Then the blade sunk down into Joni's gut. She screamed, blood and intestinal pieces spilled out of her mouth. She let out a long, painful sob before her eyes rolled away and her head fell back onto the wall. Mary slowly backed away, and she quickly faded into the air with a rush of ice-cool wind. The mirror fell off the wall and shattered onto the floor in a cloud of blood and glass. The funeral was scheduled 2 days from the horrid night, where 4 people Mary knew had died. Nancy, Nancy's mom, Mandy, and Joni. Joni was to have her funeral first. Everyone was going to be there, including Mary and the rest of the girls. The funeral would have probably been the next day, but police were investigating both Joni and Barry's body, looking for some clue. Everything was inconclusive, though. It was the next day, and it was around 12 o'clock. School had been canceled for the day of the funeral due to the incident, and Mary was presently lying on the couch, her new bed, sobbing uncontrollably. Her family had cleared out, giving her some space. Julie had tried calling Mary's house all day, leaving sad, pouty messages. She wanted Mary desperately to call and talk to her, but Mary was coping with the deaths her own way, crying her eyes out and blaming herself. Within an hour, she was just lying on the couch, staring soullessly into the TV. All she could think about was Joni, dead, a huge hole in her guts. Even the policeman was brutally cut in half. Soon Mary even switched off the TV, because that's all she was seeing on the news. Woman and daughter found bludgeoned with hammer and death of teenager accuser in Glenwood Springs deputy. Mary slowly slipped into depression, all messages ignored until they just stopped. Mary couldn't even get up from the couch for lunch when Mr. Jacobs called her. Mary turned over onto her side and pulled the blanket all the way over her head. There was a loud buzzing noise in her ear, like the vibrating of glass. Mary fell onto the floor, glass lodging itself into her arms, which seemed to be already cut and bleeding. With a quick spin, she was up on her feet again, and behind her was the decapitated police officer. He was smiling and pointing at her, his body hanging from a noose, looped around his broken neck. His legs were lying on the floor until they jumped up and kicked squarely at Mary's shins. Mary pushed the legs away with bloody, long-nailed hands to face the deputy. The deputy screamed and pulled out a small, make-up mirror. On the surface was the name Jacobs, smeared in blood. The mirror split in half, and so did the deputy, and he shattered when he hit the floor. Mary was flung backwards until she was standing in a dark, long hallway. All along the hallway were individual mirrors hanging on the walls. Each one had a different name on it, the person's head hanging right above it. Mary continued, feeling sick to her stomach, until she reached a mirror with the blood-written name Mandy on it. Mandy's head looked down on her, gapingly, eyes twitching. The next mirror said Nancy, and Nancy's face looked the same way it did the night she died. Mary screamed, running, until Joni's head and mirror hung above her. Only Joni was wordlessly warning Mary about something. Mary turned and ran, until she saw a mirror up ahead, with the name Mary Jacobs on it. A nail hung above it, vacant and welcoming. Mary sprinted away, stopping at the feet of a little girl, holding the snake scepter. The girl was crying and calling out to Mary to comfort her. Mary went to help her, but the girl disappeared into nothing. Mary crept away, sweat drenching down her forehead. The line of mirrors stopped a few yards away, and Mary was incredibly relieved. The hallway crept on, though, and a wall-length mirror appeared in front of Mary, and she smashed right into it. She did not feel the kind of pain she was supposed to, but she was certainly bewildered. She shook it off and squinted into the mirror. She screamed, hands wrapping themselves around her eyes. Her reflection was not hers. It was none other than Bloody Mary depicted on the glass. It was her, down to the blonde hair, blank eyes, purple lips, blue robe, and the deep cuts running across her skin like a road map. Mary opened up her eyes again, and she didn't see any kind of mirror anywhere. The hallway was plain and ordinary, no mirrors to be seen. Mary wanted desperately to leave, to get the hell out of there. She looked around one more time before sprinting down the winding dark hallway. It seemed to stretch on for miles, hours, days, until a dead end came up out of the black like the wall mirror that seemed to float in air. Mary stopped this time and desperately pawed at the wall, and crying for it to grow a door, some kind of exit. No such luck. Mary put her back to the wall and looked back at the other way, and she shuddered. She couldn't go back that way. It was not going to happen. She took a deep breath and turned back to the blockade to see if there was now a door or even a window. There was none of that. but now there was a mirror. The mirror split right down the middle and squirted blood at Mary like a water spigot. She screamed as the hallway was filled with red. Mary was swept up into the roaring flood. Mary's name was slowly spoken over the pastor's microphone, along with Jennifer's, Laura's, Julie's, and Wendy's. Mary, who was currently sweating like a pig and lost in thought, bolted up from her pew. Wendy and the other girls were now standing up beside the Reverend. "Is Mary Jacobs here?" Pastor Alderbell asked. Mary's father pointed up at the altar and mouthed, "Go." Mary nervously got to her feet and strode up to the altar. She got into the small line behind the pastor. Laura turned to her and smiled. "Do you know what's going on?" she asked, sweat dripping off her black strands of hair. "I'm just as lost as you," Mary whispered, giving Julie a small smile. Julie did not return it. "Now, Mandy's, Joni's, and our dear Nancy's good friends will share a few words in respect." The Reverend wrapped his arm across Julie's back and pulled her up to the pulpit. "Julie?" Julie sniffed uncomfortably, her red, teary eyes glimmering in the candlelight. She cleared her creaky, phlegmy throat quickly. "Wow, I'm lost for words. It's been a very hard few months, I must admit," Julie whispered into the pastor's microphone. "I can remember the times we shared, like when we all went down to the Greenbelt when we were 7. We fell into a sticky swamp and ran away to the park because we were afraid of our punishments. We weren't found until 2 hours later. We got quite a talking to." Many parents chuckled into their handkerchiefs, including the girls, up on the altar. Mary looked around with a slight smirk on her face until her eyes rested upon Joni's coffin, sitting a few yards away from where she stood. Mary gasped silently as Julie continued reminiscing into her childhood memories, untouched for perhaps years. No one noticed Mary step back, her eyes wide. No one noticed her mouth hanging open with a thin layer of spittle. Joni was sitting up in her coffin, her silk dress ruffled and pasted against her pale, cracked skin. Her head was directed at the frightened Mary. One eye was pointed at Julie and one at Mary. They were fixed and bloodshot, the color of milk. Her mouth was pulled back into a scared frown, her blue lips trembling. Mary turned to the congregation, but there was no realization of Joni's awakening. The vision was directed at Mary only. But why? Joni was now sitting at the edge of her coffin, her lifeless legs swinging back and forth dreadfully. Joni's face looked like a puzzle of complete gruesome displeasure and anger all at once. She spoke. "Mary, listen now!" The shaky voice, which didn't sound like Joni's at all, made Mary jump. "Your mirror, Mary, your mirror!" Joni whispered now, her eyes rolling back and forth like two tumbling dice. "Your mirror! Do away with it, Mary! Lock it up! Listen!" "What about my mirror?" Mary whispered, making Jennifer turn towards her. Mary did not notice. "Mary, listen!" Joni repeated, her words not quite matching her caterpillar lips. "I am," Mary responded. Jennifer frowned and pointed at Mary after tapping Laura on the shoulder. "Our treehouse has long since crumbled, our dreams long since forgotten," Julie continued in the background. "Mary, listen!" Joni screamed, her lips parting backwards, blood coursing out of her cheeks. "I am!" Mary screamed, the whole church turning toward her, their mouths gaping. "No! Listen!" Joni screeched, pointing a greenish finger up at the church's stained glass window, which had a long, gnarly crack spread across it. It ran straight down the cross's picture. Now that Mary was listening, she could hear the crack slowly spreading. "Mary, are you—" the pastor began, but Mary certainly wasn't listening. Nonetheless, Mary could hear evil laughter, and it was the voices of Mandy's, Joni's, Nancy's, Laura's, Julie's, Jennifer's, and Wendy's, all spliced together into one, which made Mary burst into tears and Joni into a fitful combination of screams. Joni's corpse turned a grotesque bloated blue color. Her eyes popped like balloons full of sauerkraut, and her head rolled away like a 20-pound bowling ball, rolling toward the end of the lane. Her body collapsed into the coffin in a dead clump, her legs twisting into an unnatural ball before disappearing into the casket. Mary fell to the carpeted altar, her head spinning, her body twisting. All she saw were twirls of blurry people springing towards her, helping her up, slapping her face. Mary did not fall into sleep, but into a cold trance, one of such velocity and dread that no words could describe it. But she wasn't alone.
Bloody Mary, I have your child. That crisp December 5th saw a slight turn in the weather. Icicles were melting and the snowmen were sinking. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and kids were home from school, and parents were plopping down in their sofas and chairs. The police weren't relaxing, though, especially not Officer Robert Downs and Donald Lawrence. They had been to the Jacobs household the previous week to see about asking questions about the disturbance at Penny Lane with the vandalized fence. The father, Mr. Jacobs, informed the officers that Mary and Caitlin Jacobs had been asleep the whole time. The two police thanked the man for his time and continued on their way. The next morning they returned to the Blue Log Circle off of Penny Lane and took another look at what was left behind in Miss Dolores' front and back lawns. Robert Downs dragged his foot through the fresh snow of last night. He paused. The sleeve of a jacket was sticking out of the white powder. He considered it for a moment as he carefully lifted it out of the snow. It was a heavy ski jacket. He brushed it softly and inspected his find. "Don, come here for a sec," he said to his partner. "Take a look at this." He handed Don the jacket and he looked at it with interest. "There's a rip in this jacket, almost as if it's been stabbed," Robert finished. "So what does this mean?" Donald asked, holding the jacket outwards. Robert did not answer. Donald turned the coat over and looked into the inner lining. On the tag was scribbled, "Mary Jacobs." Don's mouth fell open and he pointed this out to Robert. Rob took it and held it out in front of him. He peered down the street where he could just see the Jacobs house inside the cul-de-sac. "Well, let's get our facts straight," said Robert. Not long after this, the two policemen were on the porch of the house. No answer. The family was away. When the two men were about to turn away, the front door opened. They stood there for a few seconds waiting for someone to come out from behind the door and greet them, but no one did. "Hello?" Rob asked. He stepped forward, pushing the door open a bit more. The inside of the house was revealed, empty and silent. Rob put his hand to his gun and gave Donald a look of alert caution. Donald nodded, his hand at his own hip. Robert stepped inside the house, his gun loosely held out in front of him. Donald followed. "Is anyone here?" Ronald asked. He knew no one was, though. But how could the front door just swing open like that? Rob took a look at the door and saw that it had been unlocked. Usually when people leave, they lock the front door. Sometimes owners forget, but Rob tried to think if he had heard the lock click before the door opened. Had he? He could have. His hearing wasn't as reliable as it used to be. "Don, I'm not liking the look of this," Robert whispered over at him. Don gulped and carefully cocked his handgun. "Any sign of foul play?" he asked. Robert looked around the house quickly. "No," he said simply. Then a cry of pure pain broke through the silence. It was the voice of a woman. It was the cry of despair and anguish. This person sounded as if she had been wounded, and it came from directly under their feet. The basement. The cry came again, followed by something that sounded like a piece of furniture toppling over. The cops sprinted forward, searching every door they came to. They found the basement door in a matter of seconds and were bounding down the stairs. Robert yelled for the woman. Don screamed for anyone else to put their hands up. "Ma'am, are you okay? Hands above your head!" Once they had entered the cold basement, they saw nothing but old boxes and one unused treadmill. There was no distressed woman or anything of that nature. There was, though, not more than a few yards away, an old trunk which looked like it belonged to a circus years ago to carry costumes and props. It was turned on its side and looked like it had rolled a few feet forwards. That must have been the large bang they had heard from upstairs. "That's a huge chest," Don exclaimed. He lowered his gun. Robert snapped his head around but did not see any sign of anybody. He did not lower his gun, though. He strode over to the trunk and prodded it with the toe of his shoe. The trunk was big enough to hold a person. Maybe that was the source of the disturbance. "Can anyone hear me?" Robert asked. "Robert, you think there's someone in there?" Don asked, astonished. "That's exactly what I'm thinking." He kicked the trunk harder this time. That's when it rocked upwards and slammed Rob in the shins. He screamed out and fell on his back, the gun bouncing away. Donald sprang forward to help Robert, but the trunk twirled around like a top. The corner of its base caught Don in the backside of his thigh. He lost his footing and did the splits right there on the concrete. His knee smashed into it, and the muscle in his groin twisted into a knot. The trunk rear-ended Robert in the lower body before it bounded backwards again. Robert screamed again, reaching out for his partner. Donald got onto his hands and knees and had time to see what looked like a hand shoot out from the trunk's interior. But this hand did not break through, it went through it. It was translucent, too, and blurry. Another hand came into view, and what Donald thought was the beginnings of a head. It was hard to make out, but he could see two glazed eyes. No mouth, but there was more blood running down the lucid features. Robert got to his feet and hobbled over towards Don's resting place. Donald looked up, stunned, his hands compressed against his sore leg. His eyes were glued to the ghostly figure that was emerging from the trunk. Robert grabbed Donald by his arm and pulled him up against the solid concrete wall. The figure was now up out of the trunk and was standing next to it. Rob looked back at a woman who hovered above the ground, with no legs, no real clothing, but he could see her arms held out at her sides. The one thing that looked unmistakable and solid was a scepter of some kind, held in one of her hands. It was sculpted from gold to look like a serpent, with jewels and diamonds encrusted on the outside. She just stood there for a few seconds before, out of the open serpent's mouth, a long double-edged blade slid, which was already blood-stained and rusted. The thing laughed wickedly. Robert moved fast and snatched Don's gun from the ground.
He knew that it was no good, but he fired once through the figure, making dust of the back wall. Robert was hysterical now. He was about to fire again, but the woman appeared at Rob's feet and detached his hands from his arms in one long sweep. Robert screamed and was thrust backwards into Donald, sending them both into a dusty heap on the ground. Blood covered them both as the ghost woman loomed over them, her cold eyes laughing and mocking. She struck and sank the blade into Robert's chest, killing him instantly. Donald screeched and pushed his partner off of him. He quickly got to his feet and darted up the stairs with much effort. He could hear a woman cry out with glee, and the tread of footsteps on the steps behind him. Don screamed as he stumbled forwards onto his chest and knees. Behind him, hard laughter followed his temporarily grounded body. He scrambled up the steps. He was panting desperately, his hands reaching out at the stairs. His arm muscles helped to pull up his dead weight towards the open doorway ahead. Donald's fingers were right at the landing of the upstairs when a cold hand came through his uniform and dug into the top of his back. He howled in pain as the hand recoiled, pulling Donald backwards. He twirled his arms around in circles, trying to catch his balance, but he was gone. He tumbled back down the splintered steps, his head cracking into the wall, shoulders separating under impact, and his arm and one of his wrists snapped like twigs. On his way down, he fell through the woman, and before he died, he felt ice-cold life and death crawl into his veins and organs. Propped up against the last stair and the bottom landing was the scepter, its blade setting perpendicular for Donald. He had enough time to see it sitting there, the snake's eyes laughing and egging him on. He stuck out his elbows and kicked off at the stairs. He soared over the last few steps, but as he landed next to the dead Robert at the bottom, in a puddle of blood, his foot caught the handle of the cane and it twirled upwards into the air. Donald groaned, his head trying to raise upwards. His whole world was spinning now, and he could see a blue wisp of a woman standing in the stairwell, cold, dead eyes staring directly at Don's twisted, aching body. His head fell back onto the concrete. That's when he saw the falling cane impale into his hip. He screamed again, closing his eyes tight. Tears rolled down his chubby cheeks. When he opened his eyes again, the woman's featureless face was millimeters away. All he could see were her blank eyes, full of pain and hate. They seemed to scream out at him, cursing and mocking him. All of these mixed emotions rang inside his head after staring into those eyes. He spasmed forcefully with a serious heart attack. He twisted into a frozen knot, his eyes glassy and perplexed. His mouth was sculpted in mid-scream, his arms out in front of him, fingers gnarled. The woman simply evaporated into the air. Mrs. Norris peered outside her window around 5 o'clock to see a police car moving slowly down the road. Inside, a policeman, whose mouth and eyes were open widely, glared out of the window with a pained expression. He did not blink or move. It was like he was frozen. In the driver's seat, there was an officer who was hunched forward, his eyes closed and his hands missing from the wheel. This was very odd, but the car was driving, so there couldn't be too much wrong. Maybe he was searching blindly for something on the ground. He'd get his hands back on the wheel soon. She went away from the window, and she did not see the police car ride smoothly off the small, cracked road and onto the lake beach. It rode smoothly across the sand, past houses' backyards until it slowly drove into the lake. It treaded water until it was about 10 yards out. It sank downwards in a small spray of foam, leaving only a few bubbles to decorate the water's surface. If Mrs. Norris had checked the lake, she would have seen the Buick sitting at the bottom, quickly gathering rust. Inside, 2 dead bodies hovered loosely above their seats. One would have missing hands. If Mrs. Norris had looked out of her window again, she would have seen a blurry sequined woman emerge slowly out of the water. Once on the beach, she would just fade away, taking the tire treads in the sand with her. But she left her footprints behind, which one neighbor noticed and pondered over. They were from the lake and seemed to vanish. She didn't seem to think much about it. From the school to Mary's house was a total of 17 minutes, so the bike ride wasn't very comfortable, due to the amount of seating each person had. Mary shuddered when she looked up at her house, because it was like looking at the face of an ugly mask. "Come on," Mary said, getting off the bike and proceeding into the house. Will and her sister Katie followed, both confused and scared. Katie at least knew what Mary was planning to do, but Will was left in the dark about the whole thing. Mary strode up the stairs, headed straight toward the open door of her bedroom. Will followed close behind, Katie in the rear. Mary took a deep cleansing breath and poked her head inside the room. She gasped and pulled back out into the hall beside her boyfriend. "It's back on the wall," even after I locked it up," Mary whispered to Katie. At that, Katie began to shake. "Get the hammer. I left it in the basement, by the trunk." Katie nodded, took off down the stairs. Will looked over into Mary's face. "What's on your wall?" Will asked. "Are you talking about that creepy trunk in your basement? Did your family finally get it open?" Mary didn't answer. She proceeded back into her room and noticed how freezing cold it was. A huge plume of her breath burst out in front of her. She covered her arms and sat down on her bed, facing the horrid mirror. "It's freezing in here," Will pointed out as he stepped inside the room. Katie stepped inside after him, the hammer held out like a baton. She also commented on the room's temperature before handing the hammer over to her sister. Mary lifted the hammer and stepped toward the mirror slowly. "Mary, what are you—" She moaned as the mirror fogged over as if 10 people had just breathed on the surface, all at once, which caused Will and Katie to cower by the door. The mirror then started to hum and vibrate. On the glass, the darkness broke apart and revealed Will's reflection standing there in Mary's room, staring distantly at Mary. The mirror version of Will suddenly screamed as a long, rusty blade came into view and sliced down his forehead to his neck. He screeched as blood flew every which way, one of his eyes popping out of his socket. Blood now was starting to spray at the glass, splattering Mary's carpet and jeans. She screamed hoarsely, wiping blood away from her, but it only existed in the mirror. Will slid down the wall, leaving a streak of fresh blood. Now Katie came into frame. The same blades stabbed at her and caught her between the shoulder blades and reeled her backward. A blue hand reached out and grabbed her by the hair. The blade then came down in a shower of blood. Mary shook off the distractions. She got to her feet and raised the hammer. By the time the tool was descending towards the glass, her sister was flailing around on the floor, the blade stabbing into her stomach inside the mirror. Mary screamed her tonsils out as the hammer hit the glass and spread a large spiderweb crack across it. Off in the distance, they could hear a woman screaming out in pain. She brought the hammer back down into the mirror, breaking it off of the wall. She got down onto her hands and knees and made sure all of the large pieces had been reduced to gravel. The woman had stopped screaming, and by the time Mary brought the hammer down again, for the final time, they sat in silence. She dropped the tool and fell back onto her bed, tears rolling down her cheeks. Then Will flipped the light switch, and that's when everything came into perspective. The shards of glass were still there, and they noticed the large hole in the wall for the first time. The next day, after school, Mary did just as Miranda planned. She stayed behind to make up for a test she had missed, while Miranda and a couple of her friends broke away from the gym to roam the empty halls. Miranda circled around the history class several times, her hawk eyes plastered on the classroom door. "You remember your job, don't you?" Miranda asked her blonde friend. "I remember." Miranda smirked. She circled some more around the closed history room like a vulture as her friend prepped herself. The door swung open and Mary strode out. Katie had walked home so Mary could use her car. She pulled her keys from her tight jeans and proceeded down the hall. Outside it began to snow hard, which made Mary smile even more. She loved the snow because it only meant the holidays were closing in. From one of the classroom pods to Mary's right came the cheerleader blonde. She held a glass of red fruit punch in her hand. Mary didn't see the girl rush at her from the side and collide into her. The bright red punch catapulted at Mary's temple and soaked her face and hair in a sticky substance. Mary screeched and dropped her book bag. The blonde gave a sarcastic "sorry" and pulled back into the pod where her friends awaited her. "You're kidding me," Mary blurted, watching the cheerleader go. She shook off the liquid and started towards the restroom to clean herself off. When Mary disappeared behind the girls' room door, Miranda came out from her hiding place, ready to do her damage. Mary cupped her hands under the icy cooled water in the sink and did her best to cleanse the sticky mess off of her. She dried her face and tried to fix her hair, but soon gave up. She'd be heading home soon, so what did it matter? Miranda came in after her. Her thumbs twiddled at the end of her short cheerleader skirt. She whined helplessly, tossing back her hair with a click of her neck. Mary turned towards her and automatically gathered up her stuff, trying for the door. "Mary, please!" Miranda whined again, backing up against the restroom door. "What do you want, Miranda?" Mary prodded. "I have to talk to you. You know about Bloody Mary. Well, I did the chant thing last night and—" "Ha ha, Miranda, I get it," Mary said smugly. "I'm afraid of ghosts, right?" Mary tried one last time to push toward the door. "No, I don't joke this time. I did the chant, I saw her in the mirror, and I ran." Miranda started to fake cry, banging her forehead with her palms. "You're kidding. I don't know why I did it. I was just skeptical about the whole thing. I did it as a joke, but I know you were afraid of her, so I—" "Come on," Mary huffed. All I did was say Bloody Mary 1, Bloody Mary 2, Miranda began. Bloody Mary 3, Bloody Mary 4. Okay, Miranda, I know how it goes. Miranda slid the doorstop into the door jamb with the side of her sneaker. The other hand reached for the light switch behind her. Bloody Mary 5, Bloody Mary 6, Bloody Mary 7. Mary wrenched away from her and looked into her own reflection in the restroom mirror, then back at Miranda, who was grinning ear to ear. She was no longer crying when she switched the lights off. Bloody Mary 8. Miranda, this isn't funny, Mary moaned, reaching around the sinks. You don't know what you're doing. Bloody Mary 9. Don't! Mary stumbled toward Miranda's outline in front of her, but caught her foot around the backpack strap. She fell forwards into the sink, but was able to catch herself. Bloody Mary 10, Miranda cackled. Bloody Mary, I have your child. Mary screamed. Miranda gracefully circled around Mary until she was standing right next to the sink. You baby! Miranda threw back her head and laughed. So where is she, huh? Mary scrambled forwards and ran through the darkness, forgetting her stuff. She struck the door with her shoulder and turned the knob, but it was locked. How? Mary's foot kicked at the bottom of the door and found there was a doorstop wedged in the jamb. Mary fell to her knees and tried to unjam the doorstop. That's when Mary heard the distinct sound of cracking glass over her shoulders. Miranda stopped laughing, but Mary continued to try to dig the doorstop out from the crack. What was that, Jacobs? Miranda asked desperately. They heard dripping from the mirror, then running liquid, coursing down the wall-length mirror. It soon sounded like a fountain was in the room. Miranda screamed out in surprise as the dripping grew and grew until it sounded like they were in a waterfall. It started to cover the floor and Mary could feel it pooling around her knees. Mary tried to dig the doorstop out, but her arm muscles felt knotted up, and her sweaty fingers slipped off the rubber item. She then started to cry along with Miranda. What is this? What are you doing, Jacobs? She moaned. The rushing water stopped. Silence consumed the two girls until something was wading through the liquid, stepping towards them from one of the stalls. Mary heard the stall door swing open and clack into the wall. Footsteps came closer and closer. Is that you, Jacobs? Miranda whispered in stone-cold fear. No. Then Miranda screamed out for half a second before something sliced through the air and something else that sounded like 10 pounds of meat plopped into the water. Mary spun around and almost fainted at what she saw. A blue woman held Miranda up into the air by her neck. Miranda thrashed around, but her mouth was stifled by the enormous amount of blood, so she couldn't scream. Her arm was laying next to the ghost woman's foot. Mary tried to shut her eyes, but couldn't. This was the first time she had seen Bloody Mary up close and personal. The woman had cold fishbowl eyes with milky white pupils. Her face was purple and pussy, her caterpillar lips pulled back to show yellow rotting teeth. The cobra scepter Mary had seen in the mirror was sticking into the tiled floor. Miranda was thrown backwards into the bloody mirror, smashing it to thousands of glass shards, which scattered around Mary's huddled body. Bloody Mary once again picked up Miranda and set her neatly atop the sink. The scepter appeared in her hand. Her other bloated palm struck Miranda across the cheek, instantly waking the girl. Miranda choked, and even through the dark, Mary could see her look over at her with pleading eyes and a quivering lip. This only made the ghost woman smile even wider, as the bladed scepter connected with Miranda's gut. Mary tried to scream, but could only fall back into the door behind her, eyes glued to the glowing ghost, no more than 10 feet away. With the blade inside Miranda, Bloody Mary lifted the rag doll body up over her head and slung her backwards into the open stall. Inside, Mary heard the porcelain toilet reduced to rubble and the spray of fresh water. Mary turned back to her work and wrenched the doorstop out from the jamb with the remainder of her strength. She tossed it over her shoulder and turned for a moment so that she could get to her feet. She screamed because Bloody Mary's face was inches from her own. The decaying nose hissed like a squeaky squeeze toy as the ghost breathed. The rotten, rancid mouth was open before Mary, the pink tongue lifeless and useless. Her eye lolled back and forth as the other was rooted inside its socket. Blood ran down from it like tears. In a distant voice, which didn't seem to come from the moving mouth, Bloody Mary spoke to Mary. "I'll see you at home," Bloody Mary said simply. Mary wasn't going to wait for another second. She plowed through the door and through the empty halls. She sprinted through the fresh snow and fumbled with her keys. Once inside her car, she fell over the steering wheel and sobbed, her heart beating alarmingly fast. A soaking wet Mary tripped inside her house, her heart still beating, her hands shaking. She knew what the ghostly apparition had meant. She leapt up the stairs 3 at a time as the family came through the kitchen to welcome her. Had she really thought it was over? Mary stepped inside her bedroom, and her breath plumed out in front of her. She gasped, because there on her wall hung Bloody Mary's mirror, perfectly new and clean. She could see bloody footprints on the carpet leading back to Mary's bed from the mirror. On the bed was Mary's book bag, which she had left behind in the girls' room back at school. It was zipped up and nicely buckled. Katie followed Mary and stepped up next to her. She too gasped when she saw that the mirror was back. "Mary, the mirror," Katie began. "No, it's not just a mirror," Mary whispered. "Girls, is everything okay?" Mr. Jacobs called from the bottom of the stairs. The girls didn't answer. Between Wing and Water. It was going to be a long flight. I was in the bookstore, my fingers thumbing from one spine to the other, trying to find a title that would keep me occupied on the 2-hour flight from California to Colorado. I couldn't find a single one. They were all bestsellers at the time, books with millions of copies in print, all paperback. They would be replaced in a month's time by the new bestsellers, to be forgotten in the bargain bins. Then I came across an interesting novel inside the nonfiction section. It was titled Into the Bermuda Triangle. What really intrigued me was that it was the very last copy. On the cover was an ominous triangle diagram, blood red. I cracked it open onto the title page and didn't close it until I was safely on the plane, my soda and pretzels set out before me on my little tray. As the fasten seatbelt sign dinged off, I happened upon the chapter about Flight 19, the lost team of Avenger fighter pilots that had disappeared over the Atlantic on December 5th, 1945. It had been a simple mission, to say the least. Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor was to instruct a total of 4 students in a simulated course from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, east to a small strip of islands called Hen and Chicken Shoals, then south to the Bahamas, and then west back to the Florida coast, in a perfect triangle demonstration. He was only there as an instructor, to watch over his trainees and make sure they weren't falling behind. Their main lesson was to learn the art of dead reckoning, which involved picking out their exact location based on their last recorded time interval. So if they had left the Keys at 13:30 exactly, they should have known that another 20 minutes would bring them 67 miles due east. Everything had gone as planned until the return trip, where a strange mist, spreading as far up and down as they could see, fell upon them and forced them further and further apart. The lieutenant began to lose radio communication with his students, and they were all experiencing the same sort of phenomena. Their radios went in and out, and their compasses faltered. And not just the heading indicator, which was the common electric compass. The magnetic compass, completely free of any power sources, were unreliable as well. Through garbled radio transmissions to Fort Lauderdale Naval Base, the lieutenant told his story. "This is Lieutenant Charles Carroll Tyler, Flight 19 reaching FT-74. I don't know where we are. We must have got lost after that last turn." "This is FT-74. Please identify your coordinates so someone can help you," the radio sang back. After a long moment of static, the controller tried again. "FT-28, this is FT-74. What is your trouble?" I triggered the switch and sucked in air, not knowing how to continue. I looked down at my controls and decided that I would start there. "Both of my compasses are out, and I am trying to find Fort Lauderdale, Florida." I craned my neck to peek out the smoky glass. The outside was just as smoky, since there was a determined shroud of fog following me. I did catch fragmented hints of civilization below me, coming in and out like jigsaw pieces. "I am over land, but it is broken, and I don't know how to get to Fort Lauderdale." I did seem sure of myself over the radio, but in reality I was not positive about my location over the Florida Keys. It would make sense, since I had been headed west. Yet that was when my compass had been fully functional. I tapped the plastic cover and watched as the needle whirred crazily, stalling and then speeding up again. I wondered where I had gone wrong. I was entirely familiar with the Avenger torpedo aircraft. I'd had more than the necessary flying hours to call myself an experienced pilot. It was a simple mission, to say the least. I was to instruct a total of 4 students in a simulated course from Fort Lauderdale east to a small strip of islands called Hen and Chicken Shoals, then south to the Bahamas, and then west back to the Florida coast, in a perfect triangle demonstration. I was only there as an instructor to watch over my trainees and make sure they weren't falling behind. Their main lesson was to learn the art of dead reckoning, which involved picking out their exact location based on their last recorded time interval. So, if they had left the Keys at 13:30 exactly, they should have known another 20 minutes would bring them 67 miles due east. Everything had gone as planned until the return trip, where a strange mist, spreading as far up and down as I could see, fell upon us and forced us farther and farther apart. I began to lose radio communication between the students that were supposed to be at my nose and tail. The only ones I could still speak with were on my left and right wings, and they were experiencing the same sort of phenomena. Their radios were going in and out, and their compasses were faltering, and not just the heading indicator, which was the common electric compass. The magnetic compasses, completely free of any power sources, were unreliable as well. "Put the sun on your port wing and fly north up the coast," the radio explained. "Did you hear that? Ron? Carl? Anyone?" I was addressing my last string of trainees, hoping to God that I wasn't alone in this. "Roger, Lieutenant. The sun at port wing, and then north." That was Ron, on my left side. "Carl, do you copy?" Only dead air. I cursed under my breath and squirmed inside my seat. "Well, if anyone can hear me but cannot transmit back, find the sun and line it up with your left wing. Fly straight." The sun was just about the only certainty inside that silver sheen. I quickly made my maneuver and prayed that my students were all in concert alongside me. A few minutes later, rough turbulence rocked my plane and more of my instruments admitted to failure. My altimeter was next to go, which was there to show me my altitude above sea level. And then my airspeed indicator malfunctioned and presented me a nonsense code of zeros and ones. Now, no way of telling how fast I was flying through the air, which would be quite important in landing the plane. I tried my best to broadcast this information to the Fort Lauderdale Naval Base, but the responses kept coming back in unrecognizable jumbles. I looked back out and could see absolutely nothing to familiarize myself with. There was no land or sea. The world as I knew it was one complete whiteout. I tore my eyes off the page to peer out through the window. I could still see the desert unrolling beneath me like a wrinkled rug. I began to regret my decision of buying into the Bermuda Triangle. What had I been thinking? And why on earth was an airport bookstore selling books about airplane disappearances over the Atlantic Ocean? Was that some sort of sick joke? I began to feel completely helpless up there in that flying tin can. Never before had I felt so useless, as if I had absolutely no say whether I was safe or not, whether I was to live or die. I realized that a lot of trust went into every commercial flight. It was enough of a relief for everyone to nod hello to the pilot on the way in and look him up and down. As long as he had a smile and a clean suit, it was likely that he would be a fine pilot. But I knew that so many things could go wrong, and I could do nothing. At least inside a car, I could have total control, and I'd be able to decide when it was right to brake and get out. I knew that I could trust my own judgment, but could I trust this pilot, even after all his experience? Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor had been experienced as well. The book had said it best. He'd had more than enough flight hours to carry his team safely through the exercise, so what had gone wrong? Inside that plane, thousands of miles up in the air, all I could do was hold on. I decided that reading was a lot better for me than staring out the window, so I went back to my book. I could still see the sun's pinpoint of light behind my left wing, and I checked my watch. We should have been at the coast by now, and 17 minutes had passed since my last radio transmission with my pupil. Then Ron's voice came through, clear and precise. "Damn it, if we could just fly west, we could get home. Head west, for God's sakes." "Negative. I am heading this show. Do not redirect west. We are under strict instruction from the base." "The base? Have you? From the... recently? They're not listening." "You're not listening, FT-32. Be anything. Don't you see this isn't..." "Repeat that, FT-32. Ron, do you copy?" And that was the last I ever heard from him. Close to 1730, rain speckled my windshield, and off-coast winds sent my wings off balance. It took more than my remaining strength to keep them aligned with my altitude indicator, which served as my virtual horizon, giving me a good idea of how parallel I was with the Earth. This was my last instrument properly functioning inside my cockpit, save for my fuel gauge. I was running on empty. There was maybe an hour left of flight time, and I needed to act fast. We had started the flight exercise a little after 13:40 that afternoon, and we were now 2 hours over schedule. I finally decided to take Ron's suggestion into practice. I thumbed the radio and tried to pronounce my words confidently and without strain. "We'll fly 270 degrees west until landfall or running out of gas. We'll have to ditch unless landfall. When you reach less than 10 gallons, start to descend." I had completely lost track of the sun. The silver mist had taken on a grayish hue, dark and unyielding. The rain had let up, but not the wind. With each turbulent rip, I would yelp helplessly into my mask, straining my every muscle in my arms and legs to keep the control wheel steady. I was up and out of my seat, my seat belts forgotten, throwing all my weight back and away from the controls, praying desperately under my breath. Ahead of me, the clouds were taking on a new shape. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but a good-sized bowl was beginning to form, collapsing in on itself like a narrow funnel.
The funnel evolved into a tunnel,
braided with tongues of slick electric bolts, reaching unseen into the darkest of pits. I was headed straight into it, and I could do nothing. I was too busy trying to keep my nose level. I couldn't even begin to turn left or right, not when I didn't know where the sky ended and where the sea began. As I entered the churning tunnel, I lost all control of my muscles. I plopped back into my seat and my arms were dormant at my sides. My chin dropped to my chest and my eyes clouded. All I could do was watch as some invisible force supported my wings and carried me safely through the bright lightning flashes.
None of the 5 bomber pilots had ever been found, and neither had their planes. Since that fateful day in 1945, 120 more planes had shared Flight 19's fate, and 70 different ships. Some of the vessels had been found, either submerged or floating completely unmanned, but with no human remains. On a great majority of these occasions, a strange white mist had appeared out of nowhere at all, a blanket that seemed to follow the planes and ships as though attached to them. Just like clockwork, the compasses would fail, and then communications would cease. What was the explanation? Was the mist like a portal to another dimension, swallowing up ships and spitting them out? Or were these pilots and captains simply getting lost, to ultimately run out of gas and crash into the sea? But where were the bodies? Where was the evidence? I placed the book atop my tray and dared to look outside the picture window. I wasn't surprised to see that everything was white. I wasn't sure whether it was fog or if it was just a plume of clouds, but it didn't matter to me. It couldn't have come at a worse time. I buckled my seatbelt and dug my fingers into the armrests. The plane rocked slightly and I felt the floor tremble under my feet. I wanted to grab the handheld phone in my seat in front of me, the one with the credit card swipe, and report to the base that I was lost and I didn't know how to get home. I could almost imagine Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor answering the distress call with a warm, neighborly welcome. "You too?" he would say through a crackle of static. "I guess we'll be seeing each other soon then."
I must have lost consciousness, because when I shook myself awake, I was being spit out of the tunnel, and my hands were able to grasp the wheel once again. The mist had dispersed. I could clearly see the ocean below me, and an incoming stretch of land, emerging out of the sea like a jagged hulk of rock. The sun was positioned directly in front of me, which was strange because it had just been at my back, and it should have been ready to set close to the horizon. What was even stranger was that the sun was burning red. I checked my watch and saw that it was 1 p.m. My instruments were all working normally, except for the compass, whose needle sat perfectly steady, only it was pointing south. I switched on the radio and a voice burst through. "Tuesday, December 8th, 1945. KPPL radio. Still no news on the lost Flight 19 that went missing from Fort Lauderdale Naval Base on December 5th of last week. They are thought to have vanished without a trace in a strange coastal mist somewhere in the Atlantic. Of the 5 planes that left that afternoon, none have been found. If you get a chance to pick up the most recent issue of Argosy magazine, you'll find a story on Flight 19. The title of the article is The Bermuda Triangle, the Devil's Gateway, and I'm sure it'll bring a chill down your spine." Then the broadcast faded out into static. I landed my bomber on a stretch of desert land, too arid and bare to belong to the Keys, or any of the islands for that matter. There was no civilization anywhere to be seen, no buildings, vehicles, or radio towers of any kind. It was only vast desert as far as the eye could see. I stripped off my mask, forgetting the radio completely. I was too afraid of hearing more shaking newscasts, preaching to the masses of my very disappearance some 3 days ago. I fell out of my fuselage in a state of disorientation, crawling hand over knee across wasted sand, toward the sea, back toward the sea.